The stone is still warm when the sun begins to fall behind the forest, and for a moment the carved face seems almost alive. It stares out from the ruined wall with wide, formal eyes, its mouth fixed in the calm expression of a king, a priest, or perhaps something more dangerous than either. Around it, vines tighten over broken steps. Tree roots push between blocks that once fitted so cleanly they looked less built than summoned from the earth, somewhere above the canopy. Parrots flash and vanish. Below, in the shadowed courts, rainwater gathers in hollows where people once counted days, traced the movements of Venus, and watched the sky for signs that time was turning against them. This is not a place that looks as if it simply grew old. It looks interrupted, a world of plazas, pyramids, reservoirs, painted rooms, sweat, maize, incense, royal blood, and mathematical precision has been folded back into jungle, as if the forest waited patiently for the last drumbeat to fade. The people who built these cities did not vanish from the earth, but many of their greatest centers were abandoned. Their dynasties broke apart, and their stone inscriptions stopped speaking with the confidence they once had. What remains is stranger than a simple ruin. It is the record of a civilization deeply obsessed with cycles, endings, renewals, omens, and the possibility that the order of the world could fail. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this story is not about a cartoon version of prophecy, or a neat prediction of a single doomsday. It is about something more unsettling, an ancient people who built one of the most sophisticated systems for measuring time ever created in the pre-modern world, and who understood, perhaps more clearly than many later civilizations, that worlds do not have to last forever. The people at the center of this mystery are the Maya. Their civilization spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador, across lowland forests, limestone plains, volcanic highlands, river valleys, swamps, and coastal routes. They built cities where the terrain seemed to resist cities. They raised pyramids above jungle floors, carved histories into stone, painted books on bark paper, tracked eclipses, followed Venus through its bright and ominous appearances, and developed a writing system capable of recording dynastic politics, ritual events, mythic time, and the names of people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. Yet when modern imagination hears the words Maya and prophecy, it often rushes to the wrong ending. It thinks of a modern date, a misunderstood calendar, and a promised apocalypse that never came. That was never the real mystery. The real mystery is older, slower, and much more human. Long before modern people projected their fears onto Maya timekeeping, ancient Maya scribes and rulers were already living inside a universe where time moved in immense wheels. Days carried personalities. Periods ended and renewed. Kings performed ceremonies to hold the balance between human society and cosmic order. The past was not dead behind them, and the future was not empty ahead. Both pressed against the present. To stand in a Maya ruin at dusk is to feel how carefully this world was arranged. The stairways rise toward the sky not randomly, but with a sense of direction. Plazas open like stages where royal bodies, sacred bundles, musicians, dancers, captives, and observers once gathered. Temples sit above tombs. Tombs sit above older buildings. New construction covers old construction like memory sealed inside stone. Everywhere, architecture becomes a way of saying that time can be layered, controlled, renewed, perhaps even negotiated with. But the ruins also whisper the opposite. Time can escape control. A city can keep its monuments and lose its people. A ruler can carve his name into limestone and still be forgotten beneath moss. The classic Maya world, especially between roughly the 3rd and 9th centuries, was not one empire ruled from a single capital. It was a landscape of competing city-states, each with its own royal dynasty, allies, enemies, monuments, gods, markets, farmers, scribes, and ambitions. Cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Dos Pilas, Naranjo, and many others rose in different regions, sometimes flourishing, sometimes falling into conflict, sometimes recovering, sometimes disappearing from the political record. Their histories were not quiet. They were full of accession ceremonies, marriages, defeats, captures, dedications, droughts, construction projects, shifting alliances, and the constant labour of ordinary people whose names rarely survive. The Maya did not predict the end of their world in the simple way modern headlines once claimed. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how ancient people themselves understood every layer of their calendar and ritual language. But what survives in the record suggests a culture intensely aware of endings, not necessarily one absolute end, but many endings: the end of a day, a month, a year, a 20-year period, a royal reign, a city's supremacy, a dynasty's legitimacy, an age of order. The Maya did not need to imagine time as a straight road to a single apocalypse. They lived in a cosmos where endings arrived again and again, each one dangerous because each one required renewal. That belief did not make them passive. It made them builders. It made them observers. It made them record keepers. Their calendars were not decorations. They were instruments of power. A king who understood time could place himself at the turning points of the cosmos. A ceremony performed on the correct day could link a ruler to gods and ancestors. A monument raised at the end of a cycle could declare that order had been preserved because the king stood between earth and sky. In this way, time itself became political. It could legitimize authority, but it could also expose failure. If rains did not come, if maize withered, if enemies advanced, if captives were lost instead of taken, the claim to cosmic balance became harder to maintain. The first unsettling clue is that the Maya were not merely surprised by instability. Their own worldview expected instability. Their myths remembered previous creations and destructions. Their rituals marked completion and renewal. Their monuments tied present events to deep mythic cycles stretching far beyond any human lifetime. They lived with the knowledge that the world had changed before and would change again. This does not mean they foresaw every drought, war, or abandonment. It means their civilization already possessed a language for collapse before collapse arrived. And when the pressures did arrive, they did not come as one dramatic blow. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened across the Maya lowlands. There was no one night when every city fell silent. Instead, the evidence points toward a long crisis, unfolding unevenly across regions, population growth pressing against fragile soils. Forests cleared for fields and construction. Water systems strained by drought, rulers competing for prestige through monuments and war, trade networks shifting, noble houses fragmenting, and ordinary communities forced to make decisions that stone monuments rarely admit. Some cities failed earlier, some endured, some transformed, some people moved, some stayed, some abandoned royal centres but continued farming nearby. The end of one political world did not mean the extinction of a people. Still, there is something haunting about the silence in the inscriptions. In many southern lowland cities, The carved dates that once appeared with such regularity become rarer and then stop. The great habit of public royal timekeeping weakens. Monuments cease to proclaim ceremonies at cycle endings. The voice of kings, once so determined to bind itself to cosmic order, fades. The forest does not record the final meeting in a palace room, the last anxious calculation of stored maize, the last failed appeal to a patron deity, or the last family leaving a courtyard where generations had lived. Archaeology must work from broken floors, buried offerings, lake mud, pollen grains, bones, charcoal, reservoirs, defensive walls, and stones left unfinished. Imagine a city in its final generations. It is still impressive, still sacred, still full of people who know its paths by memory. At dawn, smoke lifts from household fires. Farmers walk toward fields cut from the forest. Scribes prepare pigments. Nobles carry the burden of inherited rivalries. Priests track the calendar, and somewhere a ruler prepares for a ceremony meant to prove that the world remains aligned. Yet beyond the plaza, there are signs no monument wants to emphasize. The dry season lasts too long. Reservoir levels fall lower than elders remember. Soil gives less than it once did. Roads are less secure. News from another city arrives not as tribute but as warning. A dynasty that seemed eternal has been broken. A captured lord has appeared on an enemy stairway. A sacred date approaches, and the old rituals must be performed, because not performing them would be unthinkable. This is where the idea of prediction becomes complicated. The Maya were not fortune-tellers peering into a crystal future. They were historians of cycles, readers of patterns, and guardians of a calendar that made repetition meaningful. If Venus had appeared in a certain phase before a war in the mythic past, its later appearance could carry danger. If a great period ended, it demanded ceremony. If previous worlds had failed, the current one was not guaranteed. Their sense of time made collapse imaginable. And when environmental and political realities began to align with that imagination, the fear must have felt less like superstition and more like recognition. A modern observer may call this coincidence. A ruler in a drought-stricken city might have called it a sign. A farmer watching maize leaves curl in the heat might not have needed any word for apocalypse. Hunger is its own prophecy. Empty reservoirs are their own calendar. A silent marketplace can predict more than a priest. The strange power of the Maya story is that their intellectual world and their material world began to echo each other. A culture built around endings found itself living through one. Yet the beginning of that story is not collapse, it is brilliance. The ruins are not impressive because they fell, they are impressive because they rose. To understand why their fears mattered, it is necessary first to understand the world they made the cities lifted above wet earth and dry limestone, the fields and causeways, the dynasties that claimed descent from gods, the astronomers watching the movements of bodies that returned with terrible precision, the artisans painting books that later flames would almost erase, and the millions of ordinary people whose labour made sacred time visible in stone. For now, the sun has dropped lower over the broken city. The carved face darkens, the jungle grows louder, insects begin their steady metallic chorus, and the steps that once carried kings into public view fade into shadow. The place feels abandoned, but not empty. It holds a question that cannot be answered by a single date, a single prophecy, or a single disaster. How does a civilization that understands endings respond when its own world begins to end? Long before the great stone cities begin to fall silent, before drought marks lake beds and royal inscriptions become fewer, The Maya world rises out of landscapes that do not seem to invite easy grandeur. This is one of the first surprises. The civilization that later appears so monumental, so mathematically precise, so confident in stone, does not grow from a single perfect river valley like the Nile, nor from a broad open plain where fields can stretch without interruption. It forms across a mosaic of environments, each one demanding a different kind of intelligence. In the southern lowlands, rain can be heavy, but surface rivers are often scarce because water sinks quickly through porous limestone. In the highlands, volcanic soils can be rich, but mountains divide communities and routes. Along coasts and river corridors, trade is possible, but so are storms, floods, and political competition. The Maya do not inherit an easy world. They learn to read a difficult one. Their earliest villages begin with farmers who understand that survival depends on timing. Maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, cacao, cotton, and other crops gradually become part of a widening world of cultivation, exchange, taste, ritual, and social identity. Maize is never just food. It is body, myth, labor, season, and memory. A field of maize is a calendar rooted in soil. Plant too early, and the seed may fail. Plant too late, and hunger follows. Rain must be anticipated. Not merely welcomed. Forest must be cleared, but not so recklessly that the land gives out. Ash, compost, terraces, raised fields, kitchen gardens, orchards, and managed woodlands all belong to this larger story of adaptation. What survives in the record suggests not a simple slash-and-burn stereotype, but a varied and often sophisticated landscape of human management. Although scholars still debate the balance of techniques used in different regions and periods, from these agricultural foundations, communities become larger, more organized, and more ambitious. The pre-classic Maya world, centuries before the famous classic period, already produces impressive centers. Places such as El Mirador in the northern Petén show that monumental construction begins earlier and on a larger scale than older models once assumed. Causeways cut across swampy ground. Massive platforms rise above the forest. Plaster surfaces shine under hard sun. The work required is immense. Stone must be quarried, carried, shaped, coated, and repaired. Lime plaster demands burning limestone, which requires fuel, which means trees, labour, and planning. Even the smooth white surfaces of sacred buildings have an environmental cost hidden inside their brightness. This is the second surprise. The Maya are not simply jungle dreamers building temples in isolation. They are engineers of visibility. Their cities are made to be seen, approached, climbed, and remembered. A pyramid rising above the canopy does not only honor a deity or house a shrine. It announces that someone has organized enough people, food, authority, and belief to lift architecture into the sky. Plazas are designed for gathering. Causeways guide movement. Reservoirs store water. Ball courts frame ritualized competition. Palaces display rank and access. The city becomes a map of power, but also a map of the cosmos, a place where human order is made to resemble sacred order. As the centuries pass, this world becomes increasingly literate in stone and image. The Maya writing system, one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient Americas, allows scribes to record names, titles, dates, rituals, victories, parentage, and mythic associations. It is not a simple set of symbols for vague ideas. It is a complex script that can represent language in detailed ways, combining signs for syllables and words. This means the Maya are able to write history. not merely decorate monuments. They can say who ruled, when he or she came to power, who was captured, which ceremony was performed, which ancestor was invoked, which period of time had ended. The survival of these texts is uneven, damaged by weather, conquest, and time, but enough remains to reveal a civilization deeply invested in memory. And memory, in this world, is never neutral. To carve a date into stone is to claim that an event deserves permanence. To place a ruler within a cosmic cycle is to make politics larger than politics. A king does not merely govern a city, he stands at a crossing point between ancestors, gods, time, and maze. Royal authority depends on performance. It must be seen in public rituals, confirmed by successful warfare, strengthened through marriage alliances, displayed through construction, and renewed at the proper moments in the calendar. The city is therefore not just an urban settlement. It is a theatre where cosmic legitimacy is repeatedly staged. The rise of the classic Maya cities is not smooth or peaceful. It unfolds through competition. Tikal, deep in the forests of northern Guatemala, becomes one of the most powerful centres, with monumental temples that still rise like stone mountains above the trees. Calakmul, in what is now Mexico, emerges as a rival power, vast and politically influential. Between and around them, other cities maneuver. Alliances form and break. Smaller kingdoms become clients, enemies, or prizes. A great city can project influence far beyond its immediate fields, but it still depends on farmers, water, roads, and loyalty. The grandeur of a royal court rests on thousands of ordinary decisions made in kitchens, fields, workshops, and market spaces. Here the sky becomes essential. Maya rulers and specialists watch celestial cycles with disciplined attention. The movements of the sun, moon, planets, and especially Venus enter ritual and political life. Venus, bright and unpredictable to the casual eye but patterned to careful observers, carries associations with danger, warfare, and timing. Eclipses, solstices, zenith passages, and seasonal shifts are not abstract astronomy. They are woven into architecture and ceremony. Certain buildings align with solar events. Certain dates carry ritual force. A city built for the sky is also a city built to persuade people that earthly authority reflects something larger and more enduring. This does not mean every pyramid is a perfect astronomical device, or that every alignment suggested by modern enthusiasts is accepted by scholars. The evidence remains incomplete, and some popular claims stretch far beyond what archaeology can support. But it is clear that skywatching matters deeply. It gives rulers a language of order. It allows time to be predicted, ceremonies to be scheduled, and power to be wrapped in the apparent certainty of celestial return. The sun disappears and returns. Venus vanishes and rises again. The moon thins and grows. The dry season yields, if the world is working, to rain. In this pattern of disappearance and renewal, the Maya find both reassurance and warning. The great cities also depend on exchange. Obsidian travels from highland sources, sharp enough to make blades that glint like dark glass. Jade moves through elite networks, green and luminous, associated with breath, life, maze, and preciousness. Shells come from distant coasts. Cacao circulates as food, luxury, offering, and perhaps currency in some contexts. Feathers, ceramics, salt, cotton, pigments, and ideas pass along routes that connect regions with different resources. A court's splendour is therefore built not only from local labour, but from a wider web of movement. The king who appears rooted in sacred place also depends on roads, merchants, allies, and negotiated access to distant goods. One lesser-known detail is how intensely these cities could be layered over themselves. A temple seen today as a single ruin may contain older temples buried inside it, each one sealed by later construction. A pyramid can be a stack of time. Builders do not always erase the past, they encase it. New rulers enlarge older sacred spaces, literally placing their reigns over previous generations. Tombs beneath temples bind the dead into the architecture of the living. The result is a city that grows like memory grows, not by wiping itself clean, but by burying, preserving, and transforming what came before. Yet this practice also reveals a pressure that will matter later. Monumental building is never free. Every expansion requires labour. Every layer consumes materials. Every courtly display depends on surplus. Every elite demand is ultimately carried by households who must farm, cook, weave, carry water, maintain terraces, repair reservoirs, raise children, honour ancestors, and still contribute to the ambitions of kings. At the height of classic Maya civilization, populations in some regions become dense. Landscapes that look like untouched jungle today were once heavily settled, crossed by paths, dotted with houses, modified by fields, and shaped by water systems. Modern LiDAR surveys have made this clearer, revealing networks of settlement hidden beneath forest canopy. The empty green wilderness imagined by early explorers was, in many places, a returned forest covering an intensely human past. This is where the rise already contains the outline of future vulnerability. The same qualities that make Maya civilization magnificent also make it demanding. A city built for the sky must still drink from the earth. A king who claims cosmic power must still answer for failed reigns. A calendar that marks renewal cannot make maize grow if reservoirs dry and fields crack. The Maya achievement is not fragile because it is primitive. It is fragile because it is complex. It links environment, politics, ritual, agriculture, trade, and memory so tightly that stress in one part can travel through the whole system. Still, at their height, the cities do not look doomed. They look astonishingly alive. Imagine approaching a major centre along a raised white road. The forest opening slowly as plastered architecture catches the light. The plaza ahead is broad and hot. Incense smoke lifts near a stairway. Painted walls glow with red, blue, yellow, and black. Nobles wear jade and shell. Scribes know the old dates. Priests carry bundles whose contents are hidden from ordinary eyes. Farmers arrive with goods. Tribute, gossip, and obligations. Children stare upward at buildings that seem older than memory. Above them all, a temple roof comb cuts into the sky, and beyond it the sun continues its measured path. In that moment, the civilization appears to have solved the problem of permanence. It has turned stone into history, skywatching into authority, maze into myth, and time into sacred machinery. Its rulers can stand before their people and claim that the cycles are known, the gods are honoured, the ancestors are present, and the world has been renewed again. But beneath the white plaster, beneath the carved dates, beneath the confidence of dynasties, a quieter truth remains. Every cycle that can be completed can also fail to renew. Every city that rises high enough to touch the sky casts a shadow below. To understand why the Maya could imagine the ending of worlds, it is necessary to enter the machinery of their time. Not a machine of bronze gears or turning wheels, but something stranger and more ambitious, a system made of numbers, names, gods, days, months, celestial movements, human ceremonies, and immense spans of history. The Maya did not treat time as an empty container through which life simply passed. Time had texture. It had character. A day was not only a position in a sequence. It carried qualities, burdens, dangers, and possibilities. To live well meant knowing where one stood within this moving pattern. At the simplest level, Maya timekeeping combined several calendars at once. One was a 260-day ritual cycle, often called the Tzolkin by modern scholars. Though names and usage varied across Maya languages and periods, it joined numbers with day names in a repeating sequence, producing days with distinct identities. Another was a 365-day solar cycle, commonly called the Hab, made of 18 months of 20 days, plus a short final period of 5 days that carried uneasy associations in later accounts. These two cycles interlocked like differently sized rings. Together they created a calendar round of 52 solar years before the same combination returned. For most ordinary human purposes, 52 years is already a long cycle. It reaches across generations. A person might see the same calendar round position return if they live long enough, but it would not be casual. It would feel like the world folding back toward a pattern once seen in youth. Yet the Maya did not stop there. They also used the long count, a system for counting days from a mythic starting point deep in the past. This allowed them to place events within vast stretches of time, far beyond a single ruler's life or even a single dynasty's memory. It is this long count that later became entangled with modern doomsday fantasies. But for the ancient Maya, it was not a ticking bomb. It was a grand historical and sacred framework. The long count is based on units that build upward. Days accumulate into 20s, then into larger periods, including the ton of 360 days, the Katun of about 20 years, and the Baktun of roughly 400 years. These were not just mathematical conveniences. Period endings mattered. They called for rituals, commemorations, offerings, and public statements of order. A ruler who presided over a period ending could claim a special role in maintaining continuity. He did not create time, but he could appear as the one who honored its turning and helped guide the community safely through it. This is one of the keys to the entire story. The Maya calendar did not predict one single end so much as it constantly produced meaningful endings. Every completed cycle was a threshold. Every threshold required attention. Time was not only measured, it was managed. When a 20-year period ended, rulers raised monuments. They performed rites. They linked themselves to ancestors and gods. They showed that the community had crossed a dangerous boundary and emerged intact. The ceremony itself was a public reassurance that the world had not slipped out of alignment. The scale of Maya time could be almost dizzying. Some inscriptions reach backward into mythological eras long before human history. Others project forward to dates unimaginably distant. The point was not always practical prediction, it was cosmic placement. A king in a forest city could connect his reign to events billions of days away in either direction, setting local politics inside a universe of staggering depth. This is a lesser-known but crucial detail. Maya scribes were not confined to short cycles or local memory. They could think with enormous numbers. Their mathematics allowed historical imagination to expand into deep time. That ability depended on one of the most important intellectual tools in world history, the use of zero as a placeholder and number within their calendrical notation. The Maya were not the only ancient people to develop sophisticated mathematics, but their use of 0 in the Americas remains remarkable. It made positional notation possible in their calendar records. It allowed scribes to count and arrange time with extraordinary precision. On stone monuments, dates could be fixed with care, tying ritual events and royal actions to exact positions in the cosmic count. Time became something that could be written down, carried forward, and made authoritative. But precision did not remove mystery. In fact, it may have deepened it. When a culture can calculate cycles, it also becomes more aware of recurrence. Venus returns, eclipses follow patterns, lunar months can be tracked, period endings can be anticipated centuries in advance. The future is not fully knowable, but it is not formless either. Certain dates wait ahead like stones in a path. People can prepare for them. Rulers can plan ceremonies around them. Scribes can embed them in monuments. A society that knows time this way may feel both powerful and trapped. The cycles will come whether humans are ready or not. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books from the later pre-Hispanic tradition, preserves astronomical tables that show the depth of this observational knowledge. Its Venus table, though preserved from a later period than the classic collapse, reflects a long tradition of tracking the planet's appearances and disappearances. Venus as morning star could be associated with danger and warfare. The planet's cycle was not merely beautiful, it could be ominous. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how specific astronomical tables were used in ritual and political decision-making. But the broader pattern is clear. Celestial order mattered because it seemed to reveal the hidden grammar of events on Earth. This does not mean the Maya believed every human action was mechanically controlled by stars. Their world was not a simple puppet theatre of astrology. It was more subtle. Time offered tendencies, dangers, openings, and obligations. A date could be favourable or heavy. A celestial event could frame a decision. A ruler could choose to act on a powerful day, turning timing into legitimacy. In this sense, the calendar was not just a record, it was a strategy. The sacred quality of time also shaped myth. In Maya tradition, as glimpsed from inscriptions, art, and later texts such as the Popol Vuh of the Quiche Maya, creation is not imagined as a single uncomplicated event. Worlds are made, altered, destroyed, and remade. Humans themselves are part of a sequence of attempts. The familiar people of Maize are not the first beings ever formed. Earlier creations fail in different ways. They are too weak, too empty, too unmindful, or otherwise incomplete. Although later colonial-era texts must be used carefully and cannot simply be projected backward unchanged onto all classic Maya cities, they preserve themes that resonate with older evidence the world has a history before the present age, and existence depends on proper relationship with sacred forces. This is why calling the Maya apocalyptic can mislead. Their thought was not centered on one final universal annihilation in the modern sense. It was centered on cycles of completion, danger, and renewal. An ending was frightening not because it was always absolute, but because renewal was never automatic. It required the correct rites, the correct offerings, the correct social order, and the continued cooperation of forces beyond human control. If that cooperation failed, the world might not end everywhere at once, but a world could end for a city, a dynasty, a people, a landscape. For a Maya ruler, this created both opportunity and risk. If he could stand at a period ending and perform the necessary rites, he became the visible hinge of time. He could show his people that the old cycle had closed and a new one had opened under his authority. But if his reign coincided with hunger, defeat, drought, or disorder, the same sacred logic could turn against him. The calendar elevated rulers, but it also exposed them. A king who claimed to sustain cosmic balance could not easily separate himself from cosmic failure. In the plazas, this would have been felt not as abstract theology but as public experience. Imagine a period-ending ceremony. People gather in heat and dust, drawn from noble houses, neighborhoods, and surrounding villages. The buildings around them are painted and alive with color. The ruler appears in heavy regalia, perhaps wearing jade, feathers, shell, and symbols of gods or ancestors. Music and incense fill the air. The date has been calculated. The monument may already be prepared. The ceremony declares that time has turned and order remains. For those watching, the meaning is not hidden. The city still stands. The king still mediates. The gods still receive. The ancestors still remember. And yet, the need to repeat such ceremonies reveals an anxiety at the heart of the system. If cosmic order were effortless, it would not require so much performance. If renewal were guaranteed, it would not need blood, incense, fasting, offerings, monuments, and public proclamation. The Maya world was confident, but not careless. It knew that order had to be made again and again. Each cycle completed was an achievement. Each future cycle was a test waiting in silence. This gives the later collapse a haunting resonance. When modern people ask whether the Maya predicted the end of their own world, the answer depends on what prediction means. They did not leave a simple message saying that their cities would decline under drought, warfare, and political fragmentation. They did not name a single final day when their civilization would vanish, but they built a worldview in which the fragility of worlds was already assumed. They measured time as a sequence of thresholds. They remembered previous creations that had failed. They tied political legitimacy to the successful renewal of cycles. They gave themselves a language for recognizing when balance was breaking. The tragedy is that the language may have been too powerful. As long as the cities prospered, the calendar made success appear cosmic. But when stress deepened, the same calendar could make crisis feel like destiny. A failed harvest was not only agricultural. A military defeat was not only political. A dry reservoir was not only environmental. Each could be read within a larger pattern of disorder. The machinery of time, once a source of confidence, could become a mirror in which people saw the outline of an ending. And still the days kept their names. The numbers kept turning. The sun rose over temple stairs. Venus vanished into brightness and returned before dawn. Scribes counted forward. Farmers watched clouds. Kings prepared ceremonies. The world had ended before in myth, and it had been remade. That was the hope. But hope, like maize, depends on rain. The first signs of strain do not arrive like thunder. They arrive as small changes that can be explained away, season by season, until explanation itself begins to wear thin. A reservoir sits lower than expected at the wrong time of year. A hillside that once held forest is opened for fields, then opened again. A ruler orders another monument, another platform, another display of power, and the labor comes from households already balancing planting, harvesting, tribute, and repair. A rival city grows more aggressive. A trade route becomes less reliable. The rains still come, but not always when they should. The maize still grows, but some fields give less. In a world trained to read patterns, these are not yet proof of catastrophe. They are warnings. The classic Maya lowlands were capable of supporting large populations, but not without careful management. Beneath the forest canopy that covers so many ruins today, ancient communities once transformed the land on a scale that early explorers did not understand. There were house mounds, terraces, field systems, roads, reservoirs, quarries, gardens, orchards, and managed wetlands. The Maya were not helpless victims of the jungle. They were active makers of landscape. Yet that success created demands. More people required more food. More food required more land, more labour, more water control, and more coordination. Complexity brought strength, but also dependence. In some regions, limestone geology made water especially precious. Rain could be abundant in the wet season and painfully scarce in the dry season. Where rivers were absent or unreliable, cities depended on reservoirs, aguadas, cisterns, and the careful shaping of catchment surfaces. Plastered plazas and channels did not only impress the eye, they could help direct rainwater into storage. A great city was partly a water machine. Its sacred architecture rose above the earth. But its survival often depended on what could be held below the surface during months when the sky gave nothing. This made drought more than a bad season. It made drought a political and religious test. If water storage failed, everything else trembled. Farmers could lose crops. Common households could face hunger. Elites could lose the surplus that supported court life. Ritual specialists, warriors, scribes, builders, and tribute obligations. The king who claimed to stand between earth and sky might still appear in feathers and jade, but if the reservoir shrank beneath him, the costume could begin to look like a question. Environmental pressure did not come only from drought. Forest clearance mattered. To build in the Maya style, especially with lime plaster, required fuel. Burning limestone into lime demanded large quantities of wood. Expanding agriculture also reduced tree cover in some areas. Scholars still debate the exact scale and regional variation of deforestation, and the evidence remains incomplete. But it is clear that certain landscapes were heavily modified. Loss of forest could worsen erosion, alter local water cycles, and reduce the resilience of soils. In a tropical environment, fertility can be deceptive. A field may produce well for a time, then decline if not managed carefully. The green abundance of the forest hides how fragile some soils can be once exposed. There were solutions, and the Maya used many of them. They terraced hillsides, cultivated wetlands, managed household gardens, and developed local strategies suited to different environments. This is important, because the story is not one of simple ecological ignorance. The Maya were often skilled land managers, but skill does not make a society invulnerable. A system can work for generations and still become strained when population grows. Rainfall shifts, political demands intensify, or warfare disrupts labor and movement. No single pressure has to destroy a civilization by itself. The danger comes when pressures overlap. By the 7th and 8th centuries in many parts of the southern lowlands, royal courts are competing fiercely. Monuments celebrate victories and accessions. Captives are displayed. Alliances bind cities together in webs of obligation and rivalry. Major powers such as Tikal and Calakmul influence surrounding kingdoms, while smaller cities seek advantage in the cracks between giants. This political world is dynamic, but also expensive. Warfare is not only fought on battlefields. It is carved into stairs, painted onto vessels, performed in rituals, and woven into royal identity. A ruler who wins can claim divine favor. A ruler who loses may not simply lose territory. He may lose the aura that makes people believe his city is protected. At the household level, these grand struggles must have felt different. A farmer living outside a royal centre may not care about every dynastic claim, but he cares when conflict makes fields unsafe, when tribute increases, when sons are drawn into labour or war, when roads become dangerous, when markets falter, when nobles demand more food to fund ceremonies designed to prove that all is well. The inscriptions preserve the names of kings, not the exhausted calculations of families deciding whether to remain near a city, move toward relatives elsewhere, hide stores, shift crops, or quietly loosen their ties to a failing court. One lesser-known detail is that the Maya collapse was not uniform even within the lowlands. Some cities suffered severe decline while others persisted, or even flourished for a time. The northern Yucatan followed a different trajectory from many southern centres. Coastal trade and later cities continued to matter. This unevenness is crucial. It shows that the crisis was not a single sweeping doom falling everywhere at once. It was a pattern of regional failures, adaptations, migrations, and transformations. Some communities were hit harder because their water systems were vulnerable. Others were exposed to warfare. Others depended heavily on political networks that broke. Others found ways to continue. Still, in the southern lowlands, something changes deeply. The old confidence becomes harder to sustain. Monumental inscriptions, once so regular in some centres, begin to thin. Construction slows or shifts in character. Defensive features appear in places where earlier architecture had emphasized display. Some sites show signs of burning, abandonment, or rapid change. In certain regions, elite residences are left behind, while ordinary occupation may continue for a time in altered form. Archaeology rarely gives a clean final scene. Instead, it offers fragments, a room not swept, a cache placed with care, a wall hastily built, a monument unfinished, a burial that suggests stress, a reservoir sediment layer that remembers drought more faithfully than any royal inscription. The most unsettling part is that many people living through the early stages of crisis may not have known they were living through collapse. They knew hardship, they knew conflict, they knew bad years and political shocks. But collapse is often a name given afterward, when the pattern becomes visible. To those inside it, the future may still seem negotiable. A new ruler might restore order, a ceremony might renew the cycle, a marriage alliance might secure peace. A strong rainy season might refill the reservoirs, a defeated enemy might reopen a route. People rarely experience the end of their world as a single clear announcement. They experience it as a series of decisions made under worsening conditions. This is why the Maya sense of time matters so much. In a civilization where endings and renewals are built into ritual life, crisis could be interpreted through familiar forms. A difficult period might be answered with more ceremony, more offerings, more public claims of legitimacy. The response to danger might be intensification rather than reform. If the world is out of balance, one answer is to perform balance more visibly. If the gods seem distant, one answer is to call them more urgently. If royal power is questioned, one answer is to carve power more deeply into stone. This does not make the Maya unusual. Many civilizations respond to stress by doubling down on the institutions that once made them strong. But institutions can become traps. A king who depends on monument building for legitimacy may demand more labor precisely when labor is needed for fields and water systems. A court that must display abundance may consume surplus even as ordinary households struggle. A political order based on divine kingship may find it difficult to admit environmental limits. A calendar that promises renewal at the proper moment may make it harder to recognize that some thresholds cannot be crossed by ritual alone. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the pattern is familiar across human history. The tools that build a world can become the tools that prevent it from adapting quickly enough. The early strains also would have altered the emotional atmosphere of Maya cities. The plazas still fill, ceremonies still occur, scribes still know the dates, incense still rises at dawn. But behind the visible order, rumor travels. People hear of a city whose ruler was captured, of fields abandoned near a border, of a dry year farther west, of tribute delayed, of nobles fleeing, of strangers arriving with stories they do not want to believe. In a literate royal culture, official monuments speak confidently. In ordinary life, uncertainty spreads in quieter ways. The land itself participates in that uncertainty. During the wet season, storms can still be violent, turning plazas slick and filling channels with brown water. The world may look healed in a single afternoon of rain. Then the dry months return, and stored water becomes a measure of survival. A society that has watched cycles for centuries knows that seasons change, but it also knows that not every cycle returns exactly as expected. The evidence from climate records suggests repeated droughts during the centuries of decline. But a drought only becomes disaster when it strikes a society already made vulnerable by density, politics, and dependence. By the time the signs become impossible to ignore, they have been gathering for generations. A little more forest cut, a little more rivalry, a little more pressure on farmers, a little less trust in kings, a little more fear around the arrival of the dry season. A world does not have to collapse because people fail to see anything. Sometimes it collapses because they see many things, but each one can still be explained, managed, postponed, or ritualized. The Maya had a language for endings, but the first ending they faced was not carved on a single monument. It was dispersed across fields, reservoirs, households, roads, and human patience. And so the cities continue, brilliant and burdened. Their temples still catch the sun, their calendars still turn, their rulers still stand before crowds as keepers of order. Yet the old promise has become more difficult to believe. A civilization built to renew time now finds that time is asking for more than ceremony. It is asking whether the entire arrangement of power, land, water, and belief can survive the pressures it has created. The answer is not yet visible in full, but it has already begun to form in the cracks. A Maya king does not rule only because he commands people. He rules because he is meant to hold the world in place. His body, his bloodline, his rituals, his victories, and his timing all become part of a public argument that the city is not merely inhabited, but protected. To modernize, a carved ruler standing stiffly on a stone monument can seem distant, almost frozen into decoration. But in his own world, that image is active. It says that order has a face. It says that time has a guardian. It says that the gods, the ancestors, the fields, the rains, the captives, and the people of the city are bound together through one figure who must continually prove that the bond still holds. This is why royal power among the classic Maya was so demanding. A ruler inherited titles, but inheritance alone was not enough. He had to perform. He had to appear on the right dates, conduct ceremonies at the proper moments, dedicate buildings, honor ancestors, receive tribute, sponsor feasts, make alliances, and, when necessary, wage war. His legitimacy was not hidden inside a palace. It was staged in plazas, carved into monuments, painted onto ceramics, buried in offerings. and repeated through the calendar. The king was not only a political leader, he was a ritual specialist whose success or failure could be read into the condition of the world around him. The Maya word often associated with divine kingship, Kuhul Ajau, suggests a lord with sacred qualities, though the exact nature of divine rulership varied by place and time. These rulers were not gods in a simple sense, walking above humanity untouched by ordinary needs. They aged, plotted, bled, married, suffered defeats, and died. But they were presented as beings able to communicate across boundaries that ordinary people could not easily cross. Through bloodletting, offerings, fasting, dance, incense, and carefully timed rites, rulers made contact with ancestors and sacred powers. What survives in the record suggests that the king's body itself could become an instrument of renewal. Blood was central to this logic. Not blood as mindless cruelty, but blood as a precious substance carrying life, lineage, and obligation. Elite bloodletting rituals, sometimes performed by rulers and royal women, appear in art and inscriptions as acts of communication with gods and ancestors. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the details of particular scenes, but the general meaning is clear enough. The ruler gives something from the body so that the larger body of the city may continue. Pain becomes proof, blood becomes language. The private body is transformed into public order. Royal women also mattered in this system more than older histories sometimes allowed. Queens and noblewomen appear in inscriptions and art as dynastic links, ritual actors, mothers of heirs, and sometimes powerful political figures in their own right. Marriage could bind cities together or legitimize claims. A royal woman's ancestry could strengthen a ruler's position. In certain cases, women ruled or served as crucial ceremonial figures. This is one of the subtler layers of Maya power. Kings stand prominently on monuments, but the stability they claim often depends on networks of kinship, marriage, motherhood, and noble negotiation that are less visible but deeply important. The ruler's connection to time was especially important at period endings. When a cartoon or other major cycle came to completion, the king could sponsor ceremonies that declared renewal. These were not casual anniversaries. They were moments when cosmic order required human attention. A monument erected at such a turning point did more than preserve a date. It announced that the ruler had fulfilled his responsibility. The city had crossed a threshold. The old period had closed. The new one had opened. The king stood there, literally and symbolically, as proof that continuity remained intact. But this promise created danger. If a ruler's power depends on the visible maintenance of balance, then imbalance becomes a political accusation. A drought is not only a climate event. A military defeat is not only a strategic failure. A famine is not only a shortage of food. In a world where kings present themselves as mediators of cosmic order, repeated disaster can make people wonder whether the mediator still has power, whether the gods still listen, whether ancestors have withdrawn favour, or whether another lineage might serve better. Royal ideology magnifies success, but it also magnifies failure. This may help explain why Maya rulers invested so heavily in display. Monuments, ceremonies, regalia, palaces, tombs, and public architecture were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were tools of government. A ruler had to make authority visible because authority depended on being believed. The city's people needed to see that the court could gather labour, summon wealth, command ritual knowledge, and place events within sacred time. A carved stela was not merely a memory, it was a claim. A pyramid was not merely a building, It was a statement that the ruler's line could organize the human and supernatural worlds into one structure. The cost of maintaining that statement could be enormous. Stone had to be quarried and moved, plaster had to be produced, specialists had to be supported, feasts had to be provisioned, captives had to be taken in war, alliances had to be maintained with gifts, marriages, and obligations. The more competitive the political landscape became, the more rulers may have felt pressure to display strength. A king who built less than his rivals risked looking weak. A king who failed to mark a sacred date risked appearing negligent. A king who could not capture enemies risked losing the aura of divine favour. Power became a performance that demanded continual renewal, just like the calendar itself. In stable times, this system could be remarkably effective. It linked households to courts, courts to ancestors, ancestors to gods, and gods to the cycles of maize and rain. It gave people a shared story in which their labour mattered beyond immediate survival. Building a temple, giving tribute, attending a ceremony, or supporting a ruler could be imagined as participation in the maintenance of the cosmos. The city was not simply extracting work from its people. It was offering them a place inside sacred history. That does not erase inequality or coercion, but it helps explain why such systems could endure. People do not build worlds of this scale through force alone. They also build them through meaning. Yet meaning becomes unstable when reality contradicts it too often. If reservoirs fail repeatedly, if fields dry, if enemies raid, if dynasties lose captives instead of taking them, the old performances become strained. The same ceremony that once reassured a crowd may begin to feel desperate. The same carved monument that once declared order may stand in a plaza where hunger is spreading. The same royal costume that once transformed a man into a cosmic figure may become heavier each year. Not because the jade has changed, but because belief has. No single inscription tells us the moment when ordinary people stopped trusting a particular king. Archaeology rarely preserves doubt. It preserves burned beams, abandoned rooms, broken ceramics, altered diets, unfinished buildings, defensive walls, and gaps in monument carving. From these traces, scholars infer stress, conflict, movement, and changing priorities. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests that in many regions royal authority weakened unevenly before some centres were abandoned. The decline of public inscriptions may be one sign that courts lost the resources, confidence, or audience needed to continue speaking in the old monumental language. The king's greatest vulnerability may have been that he promised balance in a world where balance depended on forces no human could fully control. Rainfall, soil fertility, disease, political loyalty, trade routes, and warfare all moved partly beyond the reach of ritual. A skilled ruler could manage reservoirs, sponsor agricultural works, negotiate alliances, and lead armies, but he could not command the sky. He could not guarantee that a neighbouring dynasty would remain loyal. He could not make exhausted farmers endlessly support courtly competition. He could not prevent every drought from arriving at the worst possible time. Royal ideology made him appear central to everything, which meant that when everything began to fail, failure also gathered around him. And still, it would be too simple to imagine the kings as fools trapped in empty ceremony. Many were capable political actors. They adapted, negotiated, rebuilt, and sometimes revived cities after defeat. Maya history includes resilience as well as collapse. Some dynasties survived crises that might have destroyed others. Some rulers used ritual and warfare with real strategic intelligence. The tragedy is not that they believed in time, gods, and sacred kingship. The tragedy is that their system of authority was powerful enough to build extraordinary cities, but perhaps too burdened with cosmic expectation to bend easily under prolonged stress. As the strains deepen, the ruler's ceremonies take on a sharper edge, a period ending approaches, and the rite must be done. The old words must be spoken or enacted, the ancestors must be honoured, the monument must carry the date. The city must be told that the cycle has turned safely again. Yet beyond the plaza, the fields are less forgiving. Beyond the palace, rival courts watch for weakness. Beyond the reservoirs, the dry season waits with perfect patience. The king promises balance because that is what kings are for. But the balance he promises is no longer only a sacred ideal. It has become a test that the entire world is preparing to grade. The warnings that survive are not warnings in the simple modern sense. They are not written as clear predictions carved for distant strangers to decode in a ruined city. They do not say that a specific year will bring the fall of kingdoms, the drying of reservoirs, or the emptying of plazas. Maya inscriptions are usually more formal, more political, and more sacred than that. They speak of rulers, dates, victories, dedications, gods, ancestors, captures, offerings, and period endings. Yet within that language, there is a constant awareness that time is dangerous when it turns. The stone does not shout that the world will end. It quietly insists that the world must be renewed again and again, because renewal cannot be taken for granted. A carved monument in a Maya city is often a public act of control. It fixes an event to a date and makes that date visible to anyone allowed to stand before it. The ruler appears in ceremonial dress, carrying symbols of office, sometimes standing over captives, sometimes accompanied by glyphs that tie his actions to sacred cycles. The image is not merely portraiture, it is an argument. It tells the city that the king has acted at the proper moment, that the gods and ancestors have been acknowledged, that time has been correctly handled. The monument transforms passing days into authority. But stone has a strange habit of outliving certainty. A monument made to proclaim confidence can later become evidence of anxiety. When modern archaeologists read these inscriptions, they see not only royal pride but also the pressure behind it. Why so much emphasis on completion? Why such care in marking period endings? Why such repeated insistence that rulers are binding themselves to cosmic order? The answer is partly that this was how Maya kingship worked. But beneath that, another truth appears. Societies do not ritualize renewal so intensely unless they understand that order is temporary. Some inscriptions reach deep into mythic time, linking present rulers with events from a sacred past. Others project forward into distant future dates, suggesting that scribes and kings imagine time on scales far beyond immediate politics. This ability can feel almost eerie. In some cases, ancient Maya texts refer to dates so far from ordinary life that they seem designed to place a local ceremony inside a universe nearly without limit. A king dedicating a monument in one city could be connected mathematically and ritually to events before creation or to cycles still unimaginably far ahead. This does not mean the Maya were predicting modern events. It means their sense of history was vast enough to make any single human reign feel both significant and fragile. The so-called prophetic quality of Maya civilization comes partly from this mixture of precision and vastness. A carved date looks exact, a mythic cycle sounds cosmic, a period ending feels final. Later readers, especially those looking for secret apocalypse, have often mistaken this for a countdown to destruction. But the more unsettling reading is also the more grounded one. The Maya did not need to predict a single final day. Their monuments reveal a worldview in which every age exists within larger cycles, and every cycle carries the possibility of rupture. The future is not empty, it is loaded with returning thresholds. Warnings also survive in the way rulers presented defeat and victory. Captive scenes, war records, and dynastic statements show a political world where power could be broken publicly. A captured king was not just a military prize. He was a sign that another city's order had failed. His humiliation could be carved into stairways and monuments, turning one polity's disaster into another's sacred proof. In such a world, collapse was not theoretical. People could see versions of it happening to enemies. A dynasty could be interrupted. A sacred lord could be seized. A city's protective order could be mocked in stone. One lesser-known detail is that Maya inscriptions sometimes record not just triumph, but disruptions in dynastic continuity, foreign influence, or the refounding of political order after crisis. These records can be difficult to interpret, and scholars still debate many readings, but they show that Maya history was full of breaks and restorations. The past was not imagined as a smooth golden age. It contained defeats, arrivals, interruptions, and recoveries. This matters because a people who repeatedly memorialize the restoration of order are also preserving the memory that order can fail. There were other kinds of warnings, less formal than monuments: murals, painted vessels, ritual deposits, and later books preserve images of gods, animals, storms, sacrifice, celestial beings, watery realms, death, rebirth, and cosmic instability. The Maya imagination was not gentle about existence. It understood that creation and destruction are close relatives. Rain brings maize, but storms can destroy. The underworld is terrifying, but also connected to fertility. Blood is painful, but life-giving. The sun descends each night and must travel through darkness before returning. Everywhere, the pattern repeats: survival requires passage through danger. The surviving codices, though later than the classic period and terribly few in number, deepen this impression. The Dresden Codex, Madrid Codex, Paris Codex, and Grolier or Maya Codex of Mexico are fragments of a once much larger book tradition. Most Maya books were destroyed in the colonial period, and this loss is one of the great silences in the history of the Americas. What remains includes astronomical tables, almanacs, ritual sequences, gods, offerings, and cycles of days. These books are not doomsday manuals. They're working instruments of ritual knowledge, yet they show a world in which time must be read carefully because the wrong moment can carry danger. The destruction of most Maya books also shaped modern misunderstanding. With so much written knowledge lost, later outsiders filled the gaps with fantasy. The less that survived, the more confidently some people imagined hidden prophecies. A missing library became a mirror for modern fear. But the fragments that remain point in a different direction. They show a civilization concerned with agriculture, ritual timing, celestial cycles, illness, offerings, gods, and the management of uncertainty. Their warnings were practical and sacred at once: planting, warfare, healing, ceremony, and kingship all depended on knowing the character of time. In stone, the most powerful warning may be silence itself. In many southern lowland cities, the dated monuments eventually stop. The long count inscriptions that once declared royal events become rare or vanish. A city that had spent generations speaking through carved time ceases to speak in that way. This is not the same as total abandonment at the exact moment the last inscription is made. People may have continued living in or near these places after royal monument carving ended. But the silence marks a change in political confidence. The machinery of public sacred timekeeping has faltered. Imagine a stela left unfinished. The stone is selected. Perhaps the surface is prepared. Perhaps a ruler intended to mark a period ending, a dedication, an accession, or a victory. Then something intervenes. Labour is redirected. The sponsor loses power. The city faces hunger. An enemy approaches. The ceremony never happens, or happens without the same monumental voice. The unfinished stone does not explain itself. It simply remains as an object between intention and failure. For archaeologists, such traces are delicate. One must be careful not to turn every unfinished monument into melodrama. But in a civilization where carved dates mattered so deeply, interruption carries weight. Warnings carved in stone are therefore double-edged. At the time, they were meant to reassure. They declared continuity. They announced that rulers had fulfilled their obligations. They placed cities within cosmic cycles and made endings manageable. But seen across centuries, they reveal a system under pressure from its own promises. The more rulers insist that they preserve balance, the more visible the stakes become when balance breaks. The more monuments celebrate period endings, the more haunting it becomes when the next expected monument never appears. No single inscription says, clearly and plainly, that the classic Maya world is about to collapse. That is not how the evidence works. The record is partial, formal, and often biased toward elite concerns. It preserves the voices of courts far more than farmers. It celebrates victories more than shortages. It gives dates for rituals more readily than reasons for despair. Yet what survives in the record suggests that the Maya possessed a profound vocabulary of endings before their political order began to unravel. Their monuments do not predict collapse as a weather report predicts rain. They reveal a civilization already structured around the fear that renewal might fail. This is the heart of the mystery. The Maya did not carve warnings because they knew exactly what would happen in the 9th century. They carved warnings because every completion of time was a warning. Every cycle ending said the same quiet thing: the world has reached a boundary again. Something must be done. Someone must act. The gods must be fed. The ancestors must be remembered. The king must stand in the right place at the right moment and show that the city still belongs to the order of the cosmos. And then, slowly, in city after city, the ability to make that claim weakens. The stones remain, but fewer new stones join them. The old dates still count backward from their mythic beginning, but the public voice that once counted forward with such confidence begins to fade. The forest does not need to argue with the inscriptions. It only has to grow. Roots enter cracks. Rain softens carved lines. Moss gathers over names meant to last forever. The warning was never that time would stop. The warning was that time would continue, with or without the kings who claim to master it. The long drought does not begin as a single empty sky. It begins as a pattern hidden in water, mud, stone, and memory. A few failed seasons are survivable. Ancient farmers know that rain is never perfectly obedient. Reservoirs are built because dry months are expected. Ritual calendars make room for uncertainty because uncertainty is part of life. But when dry years repeat, when recovery becomes thinner each time, when the wet season arrives late or withdraws early, drought stops being an event and becomes an atmosphere. It enters the body of a civilization quietly, through thirst, hunger, calculation, and fear. For a long time, the fall of many classic Maya cities was explained mainly through war, invasion, revolt, or vague decline. Climate was suspected, but difficult to prove. Then scientists began reading the landscape in ways no ancient scribe could have imagined. Lake sediments, cave formations, pollen, mineral deposits, and chemical signatures began to reveal histories of rainfall. In some lakes, layers of sediment preserve evidence of changing water levels. In caves, stalagmites grow slowly from dripping water, and their chemistry can reflect shifts in rainfall over centuries. These records are not perfect diaries, and scholars still debate the timing, severity, and regional effects of specific drought episodes. But the broad picture has become harder to ignore during the centuries when many southern lowland Maya cities weaken. The climate appears to become more unstable, with repeated and sometimes severe droughts. This matters because Maya cities were not equally protected against water stress. Some centers had access to rivers, lakes, wetlands, or reliable springs. Others depended heavily on stored rainwater. In many lowland areas, the limestone bedrock swallowed water quickly, leaving few permanent surface streams. A city could look powerful in the rainy season and become vulnerable in the dry season. The brilliant white plastered surfaces, the reservoirs, the channels, the carefully shaped plazas, all reveal a civilization that understood water management deeply, but they also reveal dependence. The more people a city supported, the more dangerous each failed rainy season became. The experience of drought would have differed by class. A ruler might still have stored goods, access to tribute, and ritual obligations that presented confidence in public. Nobles might draw on reserves longer than farmers, but ordinary households would feel stress early and directly. Maize stores shrink, beans are stretched, wild foods become more important, children are fed first, or not enough. People walk farther for water. Fields that once seemed reliable become uncertain. A family may delay obligations to the court, then fear punishment. A village may argue over whether to remain, whether to move toward kin, whether to risk planting again in exhausted soil, whether the gods are angry, whether the king has failed, or whether everyone is simply trapped in a cycle too large to name. Drought also changes politics. A dry year makes tribute harder to collect. Several dry years make loyalty harder to maintain. Royal courts depend on surplus, and surplus is a delicate thing. It supports scribes, artisans, warriors, builders, priests, noble households, and ceremonies. When food becomes scarce, the question of who eats becomes political. If elites continue demanding labor for monuments and rituals while farmers struggle, resentment grows. If rulers reduce demands, they may appear weak. If they raid neighbors to secure captives, food or prestige, warfare intensifies. If they fail to respond, rivals exploit the crisis. Drought is never only environmental, it becomes a test of institutions. One lesser-known detail is that some reservoirs may have become not only low but polluted. In certain Maya cities, evidence suggests that water systems could accumulate contaminants, algae, or minerals under stress. Stagnant water in a shrinking reservoir is not the same as clean abundance. In a drought, the last water may be the most dangerous water. A city can survive low supplies for a while, but disease, poor sanitation, and weakened bodies can turn scarcity into cascading crisis. The evidence remains incomplete, and this pattern would not have been identical everywhere, but it adds another layer to the problem. A reservoir is not simply full or empty. Its quality matters. The religious meaning of drought would have been profound. Rain was not merely weather, it was tied to sacred beings, mountains, caves, ancestors, and ritual obligation. The Maya rain deity, often known in scholarly literature as Chak, appears across art and inscriptions in forms associated with storm, lightning, and life-giving water. Caves and cenotes could serve as entrances to sacred watery realms. Offerings connected human communities to the forces that brought rain. In this worldview, a failed rainy season could not be reduced to meteorology. It demanded interpretation. Had the proper rites been performed, had a ruler failed, had enemies disrupted sacred order, was the current cycle heavy with danger, was the world asking for more? As drought continues, ritual may intensify rather than fade. This is a pattern seen in many societies under stress. When ordinary solutions fail, sacred solutions become more urgent. More offerings may be made, more ceremonies may be performed, more emphasis may fall on the ruler's role as mediator. To modern eyes, this can look like superstition replacing practicality, but that division is too simple. For the Maya, water management and ritual were not necessarily opposites. A reservoir could be engineered and sacred. A cave offering could exist beside agricultural planning. The problem was not that people prayed instead of thinking. The problem was that even intelligent adaptation has limits when climatic stress repeats across a densely populated, politically divided landscape. The droughts of the terminal classic period did not strike an empty wilderness. They struck a crowded and competitive world. In some regions, settlements had grown dense enough that relocation was difficult. Nearby lands were already claimed. Kin networks could absorb some movement, but not endless numbers of displaced people. If a city's water failed, its people could not simply step into unused abundance. Migration meant negotiation, conflict, dependency, or marginal land. Those who left carried skills and traditions with them, but they also carried pressure into new places. The dry years would have altered sound as much as sight. A full reservoir has insects, birds, and human activity around it. A shrinking one has mud, argument, and silence. Fields in a healthy season rustle with maize leaves. In drought, the leaves curl, stiffen, and rasp in the wind. The plazas remain wide, but gatherings feel different when stomachs are empty. Smoke from household fires may thin if food is scarce. The smell of wet earth after rain becomes not routine but emotional, almost unbearable in its relief. People who live close to seasonal uncertainty learn to read clouds with a seriousness that urban modern life has mostly forgotten. Climate evidence does not make human choice disappear. It is tempting to say drought caused the Maya collapse, but that is too blunt. Many societies endured drought. Many Maya communities endured drought. Some regions adapted better than others. The question is why certain political systems and urban centers became unable to absorb the stress. Drought was likely a major force, but it worked through existing vulnerabilities, population density, environmental modification, elite competition, warfare, trade disruption, and the ideological burden placed on rulers. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Drought was not a hand pushing over a statue. It was a long pressure applied to cracks already present. The timing also matters. Some paleoclimate studies suggest multiple drought episodes across the 8th to 10th centuries, overlapping with the decline of many southern lowland centres. This means communities may have experienced not one disaster but a series of blows. A city could survive the first dry period by using reserves. It could survive the second by demanding more labour, seeking new alliances, or raiding. By the third or fourth, resilience may have been exhausted. The most dangerous disaster is often not the first one. It is the one that arrives before recovery is complete. For kings, The drought sharpened the impossible nature of their role. They could schedule ceremonies at the correct dates, but the sky might still remain closed. They could dedicate monuments, but stone cannot fill a reservoir. They could invoke ancestors, but ancestors cannot easily repair eroded fields. If rain returned after a ceremony, authority might be strengthened. If it did not, doubt deepened. The same calendar that once displayed mastery now placed rulers under relentless judgment. Each expected rainy season became a public test. Each failed harvest became a commentary carved not in stone but in hunger. And yet people endured longer than simple clap stories allow. They adjusted diets, shifted settlements, modified fields, repaired water systems, formed alliances, moved goods, changed obligations, and tried again. The Maya were not passive figures waiting for doom. Their resilience is part of why the decline took so long and unfolded so unevenly. The end of many great cities was not immediate because people fought to keep their worlds alive. They did what humans usually do when the future narrows. They improvised, hoped, blamed, prayed, planned, and postponed the unthinkable. But the dry years kept returning. In lake mud and cave stone, their trace remains with a cold patience no royal inscription can match. The old monuments tell us what kings wanted remembered. The climate records tell us what the earth was doing while kings spoke. Together they create a darker picture, a civilization that had learned to measure time with astonishing precision, found itself caught in cycles of weather that could not be commanded, only endured. The Maya knew that worlds had ended before. In the long drought, that old sacred idea began to take the shape of daily life. Hunger does not make war inevitable, but it makes peace more expensive. In the Maya lowlands, where cities had long competed for prestige, captives, trade routes, allies, and sacred authority, environmental stress entered a world already skilled in conflict. Warfare was not invented by drought. It had deep roots in Maya political life, and inscriptions from many centuries show rulers celebrating victories, captures, and the humiliation of enemies. But when food, water, and loyalty became harder to secure, conflict took on a harsher edge. Old rivalries became more dangerous. Weak neighbors became tempting. Strong enemies became terrifying. A hungry landscape turns every boundary into a question. The classic Maya political world was made of many kingdoms rather than one unified state. This gave it flexibility, but also instability. A city could rise by alliance, marriage, warfare, or control of strategic routes. It could also fall when those ties broke. Great powers such as Tikal and Calakmul drew smaller centres into wider struggles, creating political networks that stretched across forests, wetlands, and rivers. A local war might therefore not remain local. A defeat in one place could change obligations elsewhere. A captured lord could weaken an alliance. A broken dynasty could open a corridor for rivals. In this world, power moved through relationships, and relationships could fail. Warfare among the Maya was often deeply theatrical. Captives appear on monuments in bound and humiliated poses, while victorious rulers stand above them in elaborate regalia. The capture of a noble enemies carried ritual and political value. It proved strength, fed ceremony, and allowed a ruler to display dominance before his people. But as the terminal classic crisis deepened, evidence suggests that conflict in some regions became more widespread and perhaps more destructive. Defensive walls, hilltop refuges, burned structures, hastily modified spaces, and signs of disruption point toward a world where insecurity became harder to contain. Scholars still debate how much warfare directly caused abandonment in specific cities, but few doubt that conflict formed part of the larger unravelling. A city under pressure does not need to be conquered outright to be weakened. It only needs to become unsafe enough that farmers avoid distant fields, traders choose other routes, nobles question alliances, and common people begin to doubt whether the court can protect them. Agriculture depends on confidence. A field must be planted months before it feeds anyone. If raiders may come before harvest, planting itself becomes a gamble. Roads also depend on confidence. Goods move when people believe movement is worth the risk. Once fear enters the routes between cities, scarcity spreads faster than armies. One lesser-known detail is that some Maya conflicts may have targeted not only rulers, but the symbolic heart of enemy power. Monuments could be defaced, buildings burned, sacred spaces violated, and royal tombs disturbed. To damage a city's ritual center was to attack its claim to cosmic order. A defeated king was not merely replaced like an administrator. His sacred legitimacy could be publicly broken. This made warfare psychologically devastating. It struck at the story a city told about itself. The evidence remains incomplete, and every site has its own history. Some burned layers may represent war, while others may come from ritual termination, accident, or later disturbance. Some fortifications may reflect chronic insecurity rather than a single siege. Archaeology requires caution, but across the broader pattern, the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods show enough signs of conflict to suggest that war became one of the engines of fragmentation. It did not act alone. It fed on drought, political rivalry, and weakening authority, and in turn made those problems worse. For rulers, war offered both solution and risk. A successful campaign could bring captives, tribute, prestige, and renewed confidence. It could show that the gods still favoured the dynasty. It could distract from hunger or unite factions against an enemy. But defeat could be catastrophic. A ruler who lost captives, territory, or sacred objects might lose more than military strength. He might lose the belief that held his court together. In a time of drought, war could become a desperate attempt to prove that power still worked. The more desperate the attempt, the greater the consequences of failure. For ordinary people, the experience of war would have been far less ceremonial than the monuments suggest. They would know the fear of smoke on the horizon, strangers on a path, a field abandoned before harvest, a relative taken, a market missed, a rumour of an enemy lord advancing through the forest. They might not see the formal capture carved later on a stela. They would feel the disruption in stored maize, broken tools, missing labour, and the decision to sleep somewhere safer. Royal inscriptions make war look like a sequence of named victories. Human life experiences it as uncertainty. This insecurity may have encouraged people to move away from exposed centres or toward defensible locations. In some regions, settlement patterns change in ways that suggest communities were rethinking safety. A great open plaza is magnificent when a city is confident. It is vulnerable when confidence fades. Hilltops, walls, narrower access points, and smaller dispersed settlements can become more attractive. The landscape of power begins to change shape. The old theatrical city, designed for gathering and display, has to compete with the practical need to survive. War also fractures time. A calendar ceremony depends on continuity. The right people must gather, the ruler must appear, offerings must be prepared, monuments must be carved, musicians, scribes, nobles, attendants, and labourers all play their parts. But conflict interrupts the sequence. A captive meant for ritual may not be taken. A ruler may be killed, exiled, or humiliated before a period ending. A sculptor may leave. A quarry route may become unsafe. A court may still know the sacred date but lack the means to honour it as before. When war spreads, the machinery of sacred time begins to miss its turns. There is a grim feedback loop here. The more conflict undermines ritual order, the more rulers may seek dramatic victories to restore it. The more they seek victories, the more they risk further instability. The more instability spreads, the harder it becomes to maintain agriculture and trade. The harder it becomes to maintain food and exchange, the more tempting conflict becomes. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse because the causes begin to braid together. Drought weakens surplus. Weak surplus strains loyalty. Strained loyalty invites rivalry. Rivalry disrupts production. Disruption deepens hunger. Hunger sharpens fear. Fear makes every political promise sound thinner. Some cities may have tried to absorb refugees or displaced groups. This too could bring tension. New arrivals carry labour, skills, and kinship ties, but they also need land, water, and protection. In a wet and prosperous generation, integration may be possible. In a dry and violent one, it becomes harder. The political map starts to resemble cracked plaster still recognizable, but no longer whole. Even the great powers were not immune. Tikal's long history includes defeat, recovery, and renewed monument building, showing that Maya cities could rebound from serious political shocks. Calakmul's influence also rose and shifted across centuries. But the very existence of these powerful rivals meant that many smaller centres lived in a world of pressure from above and threat from neighbours. As the larger networks weakened, client kingdoms could break away, switch sides, or fall into local struggles. Political fragmentation did not necessarily mean immediate emptiness. It meant that the old order tying cities into meaningful hierarchies was losing force. The most haunting part is that war may have continued to wear sacred clothing even as it became more destructive. Captives were still not merely prisoners. Victories were still not merely strategic. Dates still mattered. Ritual still framed violence. A ruler might attack on a meaningful day, dedicate a victory to gods, or display a captive as proof of cosmic favour. But the more the world deteriorated, the more difficult it became to distinguish sacred warfare from political desperation. The symbols remained grand. The conditions beneath them grew harsher. Imagine a city at the edge of this transformation. Its temples still rise above the canopy. Its noble houses still preserve genealogies. Its scribes still remember older victories, older alliances, older days when tribute arrived regularly and reservoirs were full. But now the outer settlements are nervous. Farmers travel in groups. Messengers move quickly and avoid certain roads. The court hears that an ally has failed to send support. A neighbouring ruler has taken captives. A minor lord has stopped attending ceremonies. A defensive wall is repaired with more urgency than elegance. The old world has not ended, but it has become armed. In such a place, prophecy is not a sentence carved in advance. It is the feeling that every sign is converging. The sky gives less water, the fields give less maize, the roads bring worse news. The king performs renewal, but enemies test his borders. The calendar approaches another threshold, and no one can be sure whether the city will cross it intact. The Maya had long believed that endings required action. War became one of those actions, a brutal attempt to seize order from disorder. But in a hungry landscape, War often does the opposite. It takes a world already under strain and teaches it to break faster. When the old systems begin to fail, people do not always abandon them. Often, they lean harder into them, because those systems are the only language they have for danger. In the Maya cities, ritual was not decoration placed on top of real life. It was one of the ways real life was held together. Rain, maize, royal authority, ancestor memory, warfare, healing, birth, death, and time itself all passed through sacred forms. So when drought lengthened, enemies pressed closer, and dynasties weakened. The response was not simply practical adjustment, it was also ritual urgency. The gods had not disappeared, but they may have seemed farther away. A city under stress can become more sacred and more frightened at the same time. Offerings may be placed with greater care, caves may receive more attention, shrines may be repaired, ancestors may be invoked more intensely. Bloodletting, sacrifice, pilgrimage, fasting, incense, and public ceremony may all become ways of asking the world to return to balance. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the meaning of many deposits and images. But what survives in the record suggests that Maya communities did not meet crisis with indifference. They answered it with action, and much of that action moved through the sacred. Caves held special power in the Maya imagination. They were not merely holes in rock. They could be entrances to the underworld, sources of water, places of emergence, and contact points with forces below the surface of ordinary life. In a drought, a cave with dripping water is more than geology. It is a sign that hidden realms still breathe. Offerings left in caves, broken vessels, incense burners, bones, and other ritual traces suggest that people sought communication in places where darkness, stone, and water met. A cave does not need to speak for people to listen. Water itself carried sacred force. Rain did not simply fall, it arrived through relationships with divine powers. Lightning split the sky like a weapon. Clouds gathered around mountains. Cenotes and pools opened into depths that seemed connected to worlds beneath the human one. If reservoirs failed and fields cracked, ritual attention to rain beings would naturally intensify. To modern eyes, this may seem like desperation. To the people living it, it may have been responsibility. If the world is out of balance, humans must do what humans are obligated to do. The gods grow silent not because people stop calling them, but because the calls no longer seem to change enough. This is one of the most painful transformations any sacred society can endure. A rite performed for generations continues to be performed, but the result weakens. The rain comes late, the harvest disappoints, the enemy survives, the king bleeds, dances, offers, and invokes. Yet the city remains afraid. At first, this may demand more ritual, then better ritual, then purer ritual, then more costly ritual. The logic is human and terrible if the world has not answered. Perhaps the offering was not strong enough. This is where sacrifice enters the story with gravity, not spectacle. Maya sacrifice took many forms across time and place, and it should not be reduced to crude images of violence. Offerings could include food, incense, jade, shell, ceramics, animals, blood from elites, and, in some contexts, human lives. Human sacrifice existed, especially connected to warfare, captives, dedication, and communication with gods. But its scale and meaning varied. Popular imagination often exaggerates or blends Maya practices with those of later Central Mexican societies. The grounded truth is still intense enough in certain moments. Human life could become part of the ritual economy through which cosmic order was sought. For a ruler, the stakes were unbearable. If the city's suffering meant sacred imbalance, then the king had to show that he was still capable of reaching the powers beyond. If ordinary offerings failed, more dramatic rites might be required. If enemies threatened, captives could become proof that the ruler still commanded force and favour. If a period ending approached, the ceremony had to be performed with even greater seriousness. The court might look outwardly magnificent in these moments, but magnificence can conceal fear. Heavy regalia, thick incense, drums, carved monuments, and gathered crowds can all become a beautiful wall built against panic. One lesser-known detail is that some late Maya ritual deposits appear to involve the deliberate termination of buildings or objects. Vessels might be broken, rooms sealed, offerings placed, spaces burned or ritually closed. Such acts do not always mean destruction by enemies. Sometimes they suggest controlled endings, a way of retiring a sacred space or transforming its power. This matters because the Maya did not see endings as mere absence. An ending could be enacted, it could be managed, marked, contained. Even as cities declined, people may have performed rituals that gave closure to buildings, shrines, or lineages. Collapse, in this sense, was not only something that happened to them. Parts of it may have been ceremonially handled. Yet ritual closure is very different from renewal. To terminate a space is to admit that something has reached its limit. A temple might be sealed. A household shrine might be abandoned with offerings. A palace room might be left with objects placed in ways that suggest more than panic. The evidence must be read carefully, but these traces offer a haunting possibility some Maya communities may have known, not abstractly but practically, that certain worlds could no longer be maintained. They did not simply flee like shadows, they ended things according to rules. As royal power weakened, sacred authority may also have shifted. Local rituals, household ancestor practices, and community-level shrines could become more important than grand royal ceremonies. If a king no longer seemed able to mediate with the gods, people still had their own dead, their own sacred places, their own obligations. The collapse of dynastic monument culture did not mean the collapse of Maya religion. It meant that some of the most visible, court-centered forms of sacred power lost their dominance. Beneath the silence of royal inscriptions, other kinds of sacred continuity likely endured. This is one of the reasons the word disappearance is misleading. The people did not vanish. Their worlds changed scale. A massive plaza ceremony could fail while a household offering continued. A royal calendar monument could stop while farmers still watched the seasons and honored local powers. A city's gods might seem silent, but the sacred did not leave the landscape. It moved through caves, springs, homes, fields, and memory. Still, for those living near the great centres, the emotional force of decline must have been immense. Imagine standing in a plaza where the monuments of earlier kings still rise. Their carved bodies proclaim victories and completed cycles. Their dates are precise. Their confidence is almost oppressive. But the present ruler cannot match them. The crowds are thinner. The tribute is poorer. The musicians still play, but news from the countryside is bad. The old stones say that time can be renewed. The living city is no longer sure. The gods grow silent most powerfully when the old answers still exist but no longer satisfy. People know the rituals. They know the sacred dates. They know the stories of previous creations and destroyed worlds. They know that renewal has happened before. But knowing the pattern does not guarantee its return. That is the quiet terror inside cyclical time. If the world has been remade before, then it can also fail before being remade again. The present age is not protected merely because it is present. No single explanation fully accounts for how ritual life changed during the collapse. Some places may have intensified public ceremonies, others may have shifted towards smaller community practices. Some elites may have lost authority quickly, others may have adapted for generations. But the broad outline is deeply human. When material systems falter, sacred systems are asked to carry more weight. Sometimes they succeed, helping communities endure. Sometimes they become overloaded by promises no ritual can keep. The silence of the gods, then, is not an atheistic silence. It is not people suddenly deciding that their beliefs were false. It is the silence felt when prayers continue and the drought remains, when blood is given and defeat still comes, when ancestors are invoked and children still go hungry. Faith can survive such moments, but institutions may not. A household can keep believing after a dynasty fails. A people can preserve sacred memory after a capital is abandoned. The collapse of a royal world is not the end of meaning. It is the breaking of one structure that claimed to organize meaning for everyone. As the crisis deepens, the old calendar keeps turning with terrible calm. It does not slow for hunger. It does not pause for war. Sacred days arrive whether cities are ready or not. The priests and scribes may still know what must be done, but knowing is not the same as being able. A ceremony requires food, labor, safety, offerings, authority, and belief. Remove enough of these, and even the most powerful date can pass without the old grandeur. That passing may have felt like a wound in time. In the fading light of a strained city, incense still rises. A ruler still appears. Somewhere, in a cave beyond the settlement, offerings are placed where water drips from stone into darkness. Families still whisper names of the dead. Farmers still scan the horizon for clouds. The world has not ended everywhere, but the great public promise that it can always be renewed from the plaza is failing. The gods may not be gone, but the city no longer knows how to make them answer. The abandonment of the stone cities was not a single exodus under a black sky. It was slower, more uneven, and in some ways more heartbreaking. People did not wake one morning across the Maya lowlands and decide that the age of kings was over. They left in stages, household by household, lineage by lineage, neighborhood by neighborhood. Sometimes after generations of stress had already changed what the city meant. A plaza could still hold ceremonies while outer settlements thinned. A palace could still contain nobles while farmers quietly moved towards safer land. A temple could remain sacred long after the court that built it had lost power. Collapse, when seen closely, is rarely a clean disappearance. It is a long argument between staying and leaving. At first, leaving may not even have seemed final. A family might move closer to relatives for a season, seeking better water or safer fields. A group might abandon one house mound and build elsewhere within the same region. Farmers might stop maintaining distant plots but continue using nearer gardens. Craftspeople might follow patrons to another court. Nobles might flee to allied cities, carrying heirlooms, sacred bundles, genealogies, and claims that could be revived if conditions improved. In a world where droughts came and went, war flared and faded, and dynasties sometimes recovered after defeat, departure did not always mean surrender. It could mean waiting. But buildings suffer when people wait too long. Plaster cracks, roof beams rot, courtyards fill with wind-blown debris, paths become overgrown, drains clog, reservoir edges slump, A city requires constant care to remain a city. Without sweepers, plasterers, water carriers, masons, priests, cooks, guards, gardeners, and children wearing paths into the earth. Monumental architecture becomes strangely helpless. Stone lasts, but urban life does not. The Maya cities that seem eternal in ruins were once maintained by daily gestures so ordinary that inscriptions almost never mention them. In many southern lowland centres, the most visible sign of abandonment is the fading of royal monument culture. The last dated stela at a site is often treated as a milestone, but it should be understood carefully. A final carved date does not always mark the last living person in the city. It marks the weakening or ending of a particular public voice, the voice of dynastic authority speaking through sacred time. People may continue to live nearby after that voice stops. They may reuse buildings, scavenge materials, make offerings, bury their dead, or remember the place in altered ways. Still, the silence matters. When kings stop carving time, something central has broken. The process differed from city to city. Some centres show evidence of violent destruction or burning. Others appear to have declined gradually. Some elite spaces were abandoned while commoner occupation persisted. Some buildings were ritually terminated, sealed, or left with offerings. In certain places, people returned after major decline, not to restore the old order, but to live among its remains. Archaeology resists a single dramatic script. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact sequence at many sites. But the broader pattern is clear enough. Many once powerful cities lost population, royal authority, and monumental activity across the terminal classic period, especially in the southern lowlands. The emotional experience of leaving must have varied. For elites, abandonment could mean the collapse of identity. A noble family's power was tied to place, ancestry, buildings, tombs, and remembered ceremonies. To leave a palace was not like changing houses. It meant severing or weakening a relationship with the dead beneath the floors, with monuments naming ancestors, with rooms where authority had been performed. They might carry portable objects, but they could not carry the city itself. A dynasty without its ceremonial centre became a claim in search of a stage. For ordinary households, the decision may have been both practical and sacred. A home was not merely shelter, it held burials, memories, hearths, tools, and the traces of generations. Leaving meant abandoning the familiar arrangement of fields, paths, neighbours, shrines, and ancestors. But staying could mean hunger, danger, or isolation. There is no need to imagine everyone leaving in panic. Some departures may have been carefully prepared. Others may have been forced by sudden violence or crop failure. Some people may have expected to return and never did. The archaeological record catches the aftermath, not the conversation. One lesser-known detail is that abandonment does not always look empty. In some places, artifacts left behind suggest rapid departure. In others, valuables were removed, spaces cleaned, or ritual deposits placed. This variety reminds us that people understood endings differently. A family fleeing an attack leaves one kind of trace. A lineage closing a house deliberately leaves another. A city losing population over decades leaves another still. The Maya did not simply disappear into the forest. They made choices under pressure, and those choices left different signatures in soil. The forest's return was also gradual. Modern visitors often imagine jungle as the original state, and ruins as intrusions. But in many regions, the dense forest covering Maya cities is a later recovery over a heavily humanized landscape. After abandonment, fields went fallow, paths vanished, managed orchards blended into secondary growth, trees rooted in plazas, animals returned to spaces once ruled by human noise. The transformation was not immediate, but over generations it became profound. A city that had organized the landscape began to be absorbed by it. The forest did not conquer in a day, it inherited. Yet even as centers emptied, the Maya people continued. This is essential. The abandonment of many classic cities was not genocide, not total extinction, and not the disappearance imagined by old romantic explorers. Populations declined in some areas, moved in others, reorganized elsewhere. Northern centers such as Chichen Itza and later Mayapan became powerful in different periods. Coastal trade expanded in some contexts. Highland communities continued their own histories. Maya languages survived. Ritual knowledge adapted. Families carried seeds, stories, techniques, and gods into new circumstances. The end of the classic southern lowland political order was devastating, but it was not the end of the Maya. This distinction between city and people changes the meaning of prophecy. If one asks whether the Maya predicted the end of themselves, the answer is no. They did not vanish, and their descendants still live today. But if one asks whether they understood that a world could end while people survived, the answer comes closer to yes. Their own myths, calendars, and rituals made room for broken ages and renewed existence. The collapse of a royal city may have felt like the death of a world. Even if life continued beyond its walls, a person can survive the end of the world they knew. History is full of such survivors. In the abandoned centres, stone retained memory longer than institutions did. Stele still named kings whose courts were gone. Temples still rose above plazas where no royal ceremony gathered. Tombs still held the dead beneath buildings no one maintained. Reservoirs still caught rain, though perhaps no organised labour kept them clear. Ball courts still framed a game no longer played there with old grandeur. The city became a container of meanings that no longer fully functioned. It was not meaningless, it was stranded. Imagine a final generation in one such place. They know the old stories because grandparents told them. They know which buildings were raised by which rulers, which stairway held captives, which plaza filled during ceremonies, which shrine belonged to which lineage. But the city around them has shrunk. Some courtyards are empty. Some noble houses are locked in silence. The forest presses closer. A child grows up treating once grand buildings as dangerous, sacred, or simply old. The past becomes larger than the present. That is one of the signs that a city is dying. Memory outweighs use. The last people to leave may not have thought of themselves as witnesses to history. They may have been tired, they may have been hungry, they may have been afraid of enemies, or convinced that better land waited elsewhere, or commanded by surviving leaders to relocate. They may have paused at a shrine, left an offering, sealed a room, or taken one last look at a stairway where kings once stood. Then the path behind them began to close. Leaves covered footprints. Animals crossed courtyards. Rain fell on carved names. Time continued, indifferent and precise. There is a strange mercy in gradual abandonment. It leaves room for adaptation. It allows people to carry culture forward. But there is also a particular sorrow in it. A sudden destruction makes a clean story. A slow emptying leaves too many almost recovered, almost renewed, almost saved by the next rainy season, almost restored by a new ruler, almost held together for one more cycle. The Maya cities were built around the idea that endings could be crossed with the right rites. In many places, they crossed some endings successfully, but eventually, for certain royal worlds, the threshold led not to renewal, but to dispersal. By the time the forest fully claims the plazas, the prophecy has become landscape, not a prophecy of a calendar date, but of stone without ceremony, temples without kings, roads without processions, reservoirs without maintenance, and monuments still counting time for an audience that has gone. The cities do not vanish, they remain, but they remain as questions. The people have moved beyond them, carrying fragments of the old world into new ones. Behind them, the carved faces darken under moss, still calm, still watching, as if they always knew that even stone cities are temporary. What survives after a world ends is rarely what outsiders expect. The grand cities lose their dynasties, their carved public dates, their crowded plazas, and the authority of kings who once claimed to stand at the hinge of time. But the people do not dissolve into legend. They continue in villages, towns, forests, highlands, coasts, and later colonial worlds that try, often violently, to rename and reorder them. They carry languages, foods, rituals, memories, farming knowledge, weaving traditions, sacred landscapes, and family lines forward. The collapse of many classic Maya centers is therefore not a disappearance. It is a transformation so deep that later observers mistook political silence for human absence. The survivors remembered in ways stone could not. A monument remembers a king's chosen version of events. A household remembers where the best soil lies, which path floods first, which hill holds ancestors, which plants cure fever, which days feel heavy, which stories explain why people are made from maize. These forms of memory rarely enter royal inscriptions, but they are often more durable. Dynasties can fail, but a planting season still returns. A palace can empty, but a grandmother's instruction can cross centuries. A sacred city can fall silent, but a language can continue shaping the world in the mouths of children. Maya communities after the classic collapse were not all the same. Some moved northward or became part of growing centers in the northern Yucatan. Some remained near older ruins in reduced forms. Some joined new political networks. Some lived in highland regions with different histories and pressures. Later cities rose with their own styles, alliances, conflicts, and sacred orders. Chichen Itza, Mayapan. And other centers show that Maya political life continued to reinvent itself long after the southern lowland crisis. The old classic order had broken, but Maya history did not end with it. This is one of the most important corrections to the popular myth. The Maya did not predict the end of their own people because their people did not end. The world that ended was a particular configuration of power divine kingship in many southern lowland city-states, sustained by monumental timekeeping, dense populations, courtly competition, and fragile environmental systems. When that world failed, people survived by loosening themselves from it, in a sense. Survival required refusing to be buried with the institutions that had once promised permanence. Yet survival did not mean forgetting. Later Maya traditions preserved deep ideas about cycles, creation, sacred time, maize, ancestors, and destroyed worlds. Colonial-era texts such as the Popol Vuh, written down after the Spanish conquest but rooted in older Quiche Maya traditions, speak of previous creations, failed beings, heroic struggles, and the making of humans from maize. Such texts must be handled carefully. They are not simple windows into the classic period. And scholars still debate how far specific themes can be traced backward. but they reveal something essential. Maya thought continued to understand existence as layered, fragile, and renewed through relationship with sacred forces. The Spanish conquest brought a different kind of ending, one more sudden in some places and more brutal in its documentary traces. Books were burned, temples were destroyed or repurposed, communities were forced into new settlements. Christian authorities tried to suppress older rituals while extracting labor and tribute. Disease devastated populations across the Americas, including Maya regions, in ways no classic collapse had done. Yet even under colonial violence, Maya communities preserved knowledge by adapting it. Sacred days were hidden inside new forms. Local rituals survived under Christian names. Languages absorbed foreign words without surrendering their structure. Memory learned to move quietly. One lesser-known detail is that Maya calendar keeping did not simply vanish after conquest. In some highland communities, ritual day counts continued, maintained by specialists who understood the character of days and the obligations attached to them. This continuity does not mean nothing changed. Much changed, and often under coercion, but the persistence of calendrical knowledge shows how deeply time remained woven into identity. The public long-count monuments of classic kings had faded, but sacred time lived on in other hands. The survivors also remembered through land. A ruined city can become a landmark, a place of danger, reverence, ancestry, or story. Caves remain sacred, mountains remain powerful, springs, cenotes, and old plazas gather meanings that do not depend on archaeologists naming them. The modern category of ruin can make such places seem dead, but for many descendants, ancient sites are not dead at all. They're part of a living landscape where past and present remain close. What looks abandoned to one eye may be inhabited by memory to another. This continuity complicates the image of the forested ruin. The tourist sees mystery, the archaeologist sees data, the descendant may see inheritance. These are not always opposed, but they are not the same. A carved stone is not only evidence of a vanished elite, it may also belong to a broader ancestral world. A temple is not only architecture, it can be a reminder that Maya presence predates conquest, nation-states, borders, and museums. The people who supposedly disappeared are still there. Speaking Maya languages, farming, teaching, organizing, worshipping, and living in the long shadow of histories often told without them. The collapse also survived as a lesson, though not always in explicit form. Communities that endure after political failure often carry a practical memory of limits. They know that rulers can fail. They know that cities can be abandoned. They know that sacred places can be destroyed and still remain sacred. They know that survival may require movement, adaptation, secrecy, or refusal. The ancient Maya sense that worlds can end did not produce despair. It produced a different kind of realism. A world can end, and still the people can continue. No single explanation fully accounts for how memory crossed the centuries. Some knowledge was broken, some was transformed, some was lost forever with burned books, dead scribes, abandoned courts, and disrupted lineages. The evidence remains incomplete, and romantic claims of perfect continuity are as misleading as claims of total disappearance. But enough continuity survives to reject the old myth of vanishing. Maya civilization did not pass from existence into silence. It changed languages of power. It moved from carved monuments to oral memory, from royal courts to community practice, from public dynastic time to living ritual time. In this sense, the survivors remembered more wisely than the stones. The stones insisted on kings. The survivors preserved life. The stones celebrated dynasties, the survivors carried maize, the stones marked period endings, the survivors crossed them. When the royal cities could no longer renew themselves, the people found other ways to remain inside time. And this changes the meaning of the ancient warnings. The Maya worldview did not simply say that endings come, it also said that endings are followed by difficult continuations. The present world itself, in many Maya traditions, exists after earlier failures. Humanity is not born into a universe that has never broken. Humanity is born after attempts, destructions, revisions, and renewals. To survive is to live in an aftermath. The classic Maya collapse made that sacred pattern historical. A world ended, and its people entered the next one carrying what they could. So the ruins are not the final page. They are a dramatic pause in a much longer story. Beyond the abandoned plazas, voices continue, fields are planted, children learn words descended from ancient tongues. Ritual specialists count days. Weavers encode patterns of identity and place. Communities resist erasure. The old kings no longer stand in the plazas to promise cosmic balance, but Maya life persists without them. Perhaps that is the deepest answer to the mystery. The ancient people who understood endings did not only predict that worlds could fall, they also proved that people can outlive the worlds that fail them. The most famous Maya prophecy was never really Maya prophecy at all. It was a modern echo chamber built around a misunderstood calendar, a handful of ancient dates, fragments of real scholarship, popular anxiety, and the very human desire to believe that the end of the world might arrive with the schedule. Long after the classic cities had fallen silent, long after colonial violence had burned most Maya books, long after living Maya communities had continued their histories in ways outsiders often ignored, the ancient calendar was pulled into a new myth. The world, people were told, would end in December 2012. The Maya had predicted it. The clock was running out. But that story says far more about the modern world than about the ancient Maya. It took a real calendrical event, the completion of a major cycle in the long count, and turned it into a fantasy of universal destruction. The date corresponded to the end of the 13th Baktun, a large period in Maya timekeeping. For the ancient Maya, period endings were meaningful. They could be sacred, ritually charged, and worthy of commemoration. But an ending of a cycle was not automatically an annihilation. The calendar did not stop. Time did not run off a cliff. A completed cycle could open into another, just as earlier cycles had done. The idea that the Maya calendar predicted a final apocalypse was a distortion, not a faithful reading. This matters because the false doomsday myth hides the real depth of Maya thought. It makes the Maya seem like mysterious prophets obsessed with our future, when in fact they were sophisticated historians of sacred time, concerned with their own worlds, their own rulers, their own gods, their own landscapes, and their own obligations. They were not waiting thousands of years to warn modern people about a movie-style catastrophe. They were using calendars to organize ritual life, political authority, memory, agriculture, astronomy, and cosmic meaning. The real Maya relationship with endings is more subtle and more powerful than the modern myth allowed. The 2012 panic also flattened Maya diversity. It treated the Maya as if they were a single vanished voice speaking one message, when Maya civilization was never that simple. There were many cities, many dynasties, many regions, many languages, many centuries of change, classic inscriptions, post-classic books, colonial-era texts, and living traditions do not all say one identical thing. Scholars still debate many details of Maya cosmology and calendar use, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially because so many books were destroyed. But across that complexity, one thing is clear: the Maya did not leave a mainstream tradition predicting the physical end of the planet in 2012. The fascination with doomsday often begins with a mistake about cycles. Modern people, especially those raised with linear ideas of history, may imagine time as a road with a beginning and an end. If a calendar cycle finishes, they assume the road must stop. But cyclical time works differently. A year ends, and another year begins. A day ends, and another day rises. A 52-year cycle completes, and the pattern starts again. A baktun ends, and the count continues. Endings are serious because they are thresholds, not because every threshold is a grave. For the Maya, thresholds could be dangerous. That is the part the modern myth accidentally touched. Though in distorted form, a period ending required attention because transitions mattered. Rituals helped move the world from one state to another. Kings could use these moments to display sacred authority. Communities could mark completion with offerings, ceremonies, and memory. The danger lay not in the arithmetic itself, but in the uncertainty of renewal. Would order continue? Had obligations been fulfilled? Were the gods honoured? Was the ruler legitimate? Was the community aligned with the forces that sustained life? These questions are deeper than a countdown. One lesser-known detail is that ancient Maya inscriptions sometimes refer to dates far beyond 2012, reaching into distant future spans that make no sense if the calendar were expected to end permanently at the 13th baktun. Such references show that Maya scribes could imagine time continuing past any single cycle boundary. Their mathematics and cosmology were expansive, not terminal in the simplistic sense. A cycle ending could be monumental without being final. It could matter enormously and still not mean extinction. The modern doomsday myth also grew because ancient ruins invite projection. A silent city in the forest seems to beg for a secret. A carved date looks like a code. A lost book tradition feels like a missing warning. When people do not understand a writing system, they often imagine it contains whatever they fear most. For centuries, outsiders looked at Maya ruins and invented stories: lost tribes, vanished races, Atlantis-like fantasies, alien builders, mystical masters of time. These ideas were wrong, but they were emotionally convenient. They made the ruins less human and therefore easier to romanticize. The truth is more demanding. The Maya were not supernatural timekeepers who vanished after delivering a prophecy. They were human beings who built cities, governed kingdoms, raised children, fought wars, stored water, buried ancestors, counted days, and made mistakes. Their world ended in some places not because a calendar commanded it, but because human systems became vulnerable to drought, conflict, political strain, environmental pressure, and the limits of royal authority. That reality is less sensational than doomsday, but far more frightening. It means collapse does not require a cosmic deadline. It can arise from ordinary decisions, repeated pressures, and the slow failure to adapt. The myth of doomsday also distracts from living Maya voices. During the 2012 frenzy, many modern Maya people objected to the way their heritage was being used. Their calendars, histories, and identities were turned into entertainment for outsiders. Ancient knowledge was treated as a puzzle belonging to everyone except the descendants of the people who made it. This is a familiar pattern in the history of archaeology. The dead are made mysterious, while the living are ignored. But the Maya are not only ancient, They are present. Any serious telling of this story must remember that the people behind the ruins have descendants who continue to interpret, protect, and live with that inheritance. Still, the popularity of the 2012 myth reveals something worth examining. Modern civilization is also anxious about time. It measures climate change, economic instability, political fragmentation, mass extinction, technological risk, and social distrust. It watches graphs rise and systems strain. It lives with warnings from scientists, historians, and its own uneasy imagination. Perhaps that is why a misunderstood Maya cycle became so powerful. People were not really afraid because the Maya had predicted the end. They were afraid because they already sensed fragility in their own world and wanted an ancient mirror to confirm it. In that sense, the false prophecy accidentally points back to the true one. The ancient Maya did not predict our apocalypse, but their history does warn that complex societies can become trapped by the systems that once made them successful. Their kings used time to legitimize power. Their cities mastered water until water became their vulnerability. Their political competition produced brilliance and instability. Their rituals renewed order until order demanded more than ritual could provide. This is not a mystical forecast, it is a historical pattern. The real doomsday in the Maya story is not December 21st, 2012. It is a dry reservoir in a crowded city. It is a field that fails for the third time before a household has recovered from the second. It is a ruler performing confidence while allies fall away. It is a monument that never gets carved. It is a child growing up in a plaza where the older generation remembers ceremonies too grand to imagine returning. It is the moment when people realize that the institutions meant to protect the world are now part of what endangers it. That is why the myth of doomsday must be stripped away, not to make the story smaller, but to make it more real. The Maya understanding of endings was not crude destruction. It was cyclical, ritual, historical, and human. They knew that time turns. They knew that completion is dangerous. They knew that worlds before theirs had failed in sacred story. And when parts of their own political world began to fail, they had language for the terror of that recognition. Not a date circled in red for the end of the planet, but a deeper awareness that no order is permanent unless it can renew itself. So the modern apocalypse fades, leaving something older behind. The calendar does not end, it turns. The carved stones do not predict our doom. They remember a civilization trying to hold its own world together. The real mystery is not why the Maya imagined endings. The real mystery is why later people needed so badly to misunderstand them. For centuries, the forest hid the scale of what had happened. Early visitors saw temples rising from green darkness and imagined isolated ceremonial centers, mysterious monuments standing apart from ordinary life. The jungle made the Maya cities look like islands of stone in an empty wilderness. It encouraged the old romance of disappearance, but the forest was not telling the whole truth. Beneath roots, leaves, and soil lay roads, terraces, platforms, house mounds, canals, reservoirs, field systems, quarries, walls, and neighborhoods. The ruins were not lonely monuments. They were the exposed peaks of entire human landscapes. Modern archaeology has changed the story by learning how to see through the canopy. LIDAR, a scanning technology that maps ground surfaces from above, has revealed vast settlement patterns hidden beneath vegetation. What once looked like scattered ruins now appears as networks of cities, suburbs, farms, roads, and modified terrain. In some regions, the density is astonishing. The Maya lowlands were not untouched wilderness with a few sacred centers. They were heavily inhabited and carefully altered. This does not mean every area was equally crowded or that all estimates are settled. Scholars still debate population numbers, land use, and regional variation. But the old picture of small priestly centers surrounded by empty jungle has been broken. This matters because collapse looks different when the scale becomes visible. A small ceremonial center can be abandoned for many reasons. A dense urban and agricultural landscape requires deeper explanation. It means the crisis affected not only royal courts, but whole systems of food production, water management, labor, movement, and local community life. It means that when major centers declined, they were not just losing kings. They were losing the organization that helped coordinate thousands of lives across a demanding environment. The evidence does not come from lidar alone. Lake sediments preserve pollen, charcoal, and chemical traces that reveal changing vegetation, erosion, burning, and rainfall. Cave formations hold mineral signatures of wetter and drier periods. Human bones can show signs of diet, stress, disease, migration, and violence. Household archaeology reveals how ordinary people cooked, stored, repaired, worshipped, and adapted. Reservoir studies show both engineering skill and vulnerability. Ceramic styles track shifting trade and identity. Obsidian sources reveal exchange networks. Every fragment adds a small correction to the old myth. One of the most powerful changes in recent archaeology is the movement away from seeing Maya history only through kings. The inscriptions remain invaluable, but they are elite texts. They tell us what rulers wanted remembered. Beneath them is another archive floors swept for generations. Hearths rebuilt, grinding stones worn smooth, burials beneath houses, children's remains, broken pots, food residues, tools, garden soils, and the architecture of everyday survival. This evidence shows that Maya civilization was not just a system of temples and calendars. It was millions of acts of labor, care, obligation, adaptation, and endurance. LIDAR has also revealed causeways, sometimes called sakbiob, linking parts of settlements and ceremonial spaces. These raised white roads were more than practical paths. They organized movement and meaning. In a world where processions, trade, tribute, and political ties mattered, roads made relationships visible on the land. Their presence beneath the forest reminds us that Maya cities were connected, not isolated. Goods, people, news, rituals, and conflict moved through these networks. When crisis came, those same connections could spread instability as well as support. Water systems are among the most revealing traces. Reservoirs, channels, dams, and catchment surfaces show an impressive understanding of seasonal water storage. Some cities were carefully designed to capture rain and hold it through dry months. This makes the drought evidence more tragic, not less. The Maya were not ignorant of water management. They built for it. But the larger and denser the population became, the less margin for error remained. Archaeology shows ingenuity and vulnerability in the same basin. There are also clues in what people ate. Studies of human remains, plant residues, and settlement patterns suggest changing diets in some places as stress increased. Maize remained central, but people may have relied more heavily on alternative foods, wild resources, or different agricultural strategies during difficult periods. Skeletal evidence can sometimes reveal malnutrition or physiological stress, though interpretation is complex and varies by site. The evidence remains incomplete. But bodies carry histories that monuments omit. A king's inscription may proclaim victory, a child's bones may remember hunger. The forest itself preserves contradictions. In some areas, pollen records suggest deforestation before decline, and forest recovery afterward. Charcoal can point to burning, whether from agriculture, land clearance, or other human activity. Erosion layers may indicate exposed soils washing into lakes. These signs show that the landscape was changing along with society, yet they do not support a simplistic story of people foolishly destroying everything. Maya land use was diverse and often sustainable for long periods. The problem was not merely human impact, it was the interaction of human impact with population pressure, political demands, climate stress, and the limits of particular local systems. Another striking layer comes from fortifications. At some sites, walls, ditches, palisade traces, or defensive placement suggest growing insecurity. These features change the atmosphere of the ancient landscape. A city designed for public display begins to show concern for defense. Settlements move toward protected locations. Access becomes controlled. This does not mean every fortified site was built in panic, but it does reveal that conflict and fear shaped choices. The built environment begins to speak of a world less confident in open plazas and more aware of threat. Archaeology also reveals that collapse did not erase all complexity. Some regions reorganized, northern centers grew in importance, trade routes shifted, coastal networks became more significant. People continued building, worshipping, trading, and governing in new forms. This unevenness is one of the strongest pieces of evidence against any single cause explanation. If drought alone ended everything, the pattern would be simpler. If war alone did it, the map would be cleaner instead. The evidence shows a mosaic severe decline here, persistence there, transformation elsewhere. Human history almost always resists the neatness people want from it. The most surprising discovery beneath the forest may be this: the Maya collapse was both larger and less absolute than the old myth claimed. Larger, because the civilization's landscape was more populous, connected, and engineered than once believed. So the disruption affected vast systems. Less absolute, because archaeology also shows continuity, adaptation, and survival beyond the fall of specific royal centers. The forest hides both grandeur and recovery. It covers the wounds and the persistence. Standing above a LiDAR map, the ancient world reappears like a ghost image. Lines cross swamps, platforms cluster in patterns, roads emerge where only trees can be seen from the ground. The city is suddenly not a ruin but a network. The collapse is suddenly not a mystery of vanished priests but a crisis of households, reservoirs, fields, rulers, roads, and choices. The prophecy, if it can be called that, is no longer hidden in a calendar. It is written in the relationship between complexity and stress. What the evidence beneath the forest reveals is not a people obsessed with doom, but a civilization that built brilliantly inside risk. They made dense cities in difficult environments. They learned the sky and reshaped the land. They created memory in stone and managed water with patience. They endured for centuries. Then, when climate, conflict, politics, and ecological strain converged, many of their greatest centers could no longer hold their worlds together. The forest returned, not because the Maya were never there, but because they had been there so intensely that their absence gave the land room to grow over the proof. No single end explains it. That may be the most difficult truth in the Maya story, because human beings prefer collapse to have a clear villain, a drought, a war, a failed king, a ruined forest, a broken trade route, a superstition, a rebellion, a plague. One cause is easier to remember and easier to turn into warning, but the fall of many classic Maya cities refuses that simplicity. The evidence points instead to convergence, to stresses arriving together and reinforcing one another until systems that had worked for centuries began to fail in ways no single reform could easily repair. Drought mattered deeply. The climate records from lakes and caves have made it impossible to treat rainfall as a minor background detail. Repeated dry periods struck societies that depended on seasonal water storage, careful farming, and surplus. In cities without reliable rivers, a failed rainy season was not an inconvenience. It threatened the physical basis of urban life. Yet drought alone cannot explain why some centres declined more severely than others, why some regions transformed rather than emptied, or why Maya culture continued beyond the crisis. Climate applied pressure, but society determined how that pressure moved. Warfare mattered as well. The inscriptions and archaeological traces show a political world where conflict was already woven into rulership. Captives, victories, and rival dynasties were not accidental features. They were part of how kings proved power. As resources tightened and loyalties weakened, war could become more destructive, more frequent, or more destabilizing in some areas. But war alone also fails as a complete explanation. Conflict had existed long before the terminal classic crisis. Many cities fought and recovered. The question is not simply why there was war, but why war became harder to absorb when other forms of resilience were weakening. Population pressure mattered. The Maya lowlands supported dense settlement in many regions, and modern mapping has revealed landscapes far more occupied and managed than earlier scholars imagined. More people meant more labour and more creativity, but also more demand for maize, water, fuel, and land. Dense societies can be resilient when coordination is strong and conditions are favourable. They can also become brittle when storage fails, when fields degrade, when elites demand too much, or when movement becomes dangerous. Population is not destiny, but it changes the scale of every problem. Environmental transformation mattered. Forests were cleared, soils were worked, wetlands modified, hillsides terraced, and limestone burned for plaster. The Maya were skilled land managers, not careless destroyers, yet even skilled systems have limits. In some areas, deforestation may have worsened erosion or affected local water cycles. In others, intensive farming may have remained productive for long periods. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally varied. The danger lies in imagining either extreme, that the Maya foolishly ruined paradise, or that environmental impact played no role at all. The truth is more complex. They built a human landscape, and that landscape carried both strength and cost. Politics mattered perhaps most subtly. The classic Maya world was not a centralized empire that could redistribute resources across the entire region under one authority. It was a shifting network of courts, rivals, allies, subordinate centers, and ambitious dynasties. This made political life flexible and creative, but also fragmented. In a crisis, fragmentation can be deadly. One city may hoard resources, another may raid, a third may switch alliances. A fourth may collapse and send refugees outward. Without a single stabilizing structure, problems that required cooperation could become opportunities for competition. Royal ideology mattered too. Maya kingship linked political legitimacy to cosmic balance. This gave rulers immense symbolic power when conditions were good. It allowed them to organize labor, inspire loyalty, and frame public life inside sacred time. But when drought, defeat, and hunger spread, the same ideology became dangerous. A king who promises renewal must answer for failed renewal. If he cannot bring rain, protect fields, defeat enemies, or maintain ceremonies, his sacred aura thins. The system that once made authority radiant also made failure visible. Economy mattered. Trade in jade, obsidian, salt, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and other goods connected regions and supported elite life. When routes became unsafe or political networks broke, courts lost access to materials that displayed status and maintained alliances. A noble world depends not only on belief but on objects, ornaments, weapons, offerings, feasting goods, cloth, pigments, blades, and food. When exchange falters, prestige becomes harder to perform. A king without the materials of kingship is still a king in name, but his world has begun to shrink. Religion mattered, but not in the crude sense that belief caused collapse. Ritual helped hold communities together. It gave meaning to suffering, structure to time, and continuity across generations. But sacred systems can be overloaded. When rituals meant to renew order are asked to solve drought, war, hunger, political fragmentation, and ecological strain all at once, they may intensify without restoring confidence. People may keep believing while losing faith in the institutions that claim to mediate belief. A household shrine can endure after a royal temple loses authority. Human choice mattered at every stage. This is easy to forget when speaking of climate and collapse. People chose to build, to fight, to ally, to tax, to migrate, to stay, to intensify rituals, to abandon fields, to repair reservoirs, to trust rulers, to resist rulers, to close buildings, to carry memories elsewhere. Many choices were made under constraint. Hunger narrows options. War narrows them further. But collapse is not something that simply happens to people like weather. It is also the accumulation of decisions made when every available path is flawed. The most honest explanation is therefore not a straight line but a web. Drought reduced water and food. Reduced surplus weakened royal courts. Weak courts struggled to maintain rituals, armies, and alliances. Weakened alliances increased conflict. Conflict disrupted farming and trade. Disrupted farming deepened hunger. Hunger undermined loyalty. Lost loyalty weakened kings. Weak kings demanded more visible proof of power, sometimes through war or ritual display. Those demands strained households further. Each pressure fed the next. By the time the system was visibly breaking, no single repair could restore the whole. This is why the Maya story feels so modern, not because their world was the same as ours, and not because ancient history should be forced into easy lessons, but because complex societies often fail through interaction. People search for the one cause, while the real danger lies in the connections. A drought becomes disastrous because politics is brittle. A war becomes ruinous because food systems are stressed. A bad ruler becomes catastrophic because institutions depend too heavily on personal legitimacy. A ritual system becomes desperate because material conditions no longer support its promises. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor, and they should. Different cities follow different paths. Tikal's history was not identical to Copan's. Calakmul's decline was not the same as Palenque's transformation. Northern Yucatan did not simply mirror the southern lowlands. The Maya world was too large, too diverse, and too long-lived for one explanation to fit everywhere. But across the evidence, the broad pattern remains. Many classic political centres became unable to renew the conditions that has once sustained them. That phrase matters, unable to renew. It brings the story back to time. The Maya did not believe endings were impossible. Their calendars made endings visible. Their rituals made renewal necessary. Their kings built authority around the promise that cycles could be crossed safely. But in the centuries of crisis, renewal became harder in the material world. It was not enough for a date to turn. Water had to return. Fields had to produce. Roads had to remain open. People had to believe. The gods had to seem reachable. The ruler had to persuade. The city had to function. When too many of those requirements failed together, the old world lost its ability to begin again. That is the kind of end the Maya may have understood better than most, not a final destruction of all life, but the failure of a world to renew itself at the moment renewal is demanded. The calendar still turned, the sun still rose, Venus still appeared in the morning sky, rain still fell somewhere, children were still born, people still spoke Maya languages. But many stone cities could no longer translate those continuities into political survival. No single end explains it because there was no single end. There were many endings, overlapping. The end of particular dynasties, the end of certain trade relationships, the end of reliable water storage in some places, the end of public monument carving, the end of confidence in certain kings, the end of dense occupation in vulnerable landscapes, the end of old alliances, the end of ceremonial grandeur in plazas where the past stood taller than the present. Each ending was partial, but together they became an age. In that age, the ancient warning was fulfilled in a way no simple prophecy could capture. Worlds end when the relationships that sustain them break faster than people can repair them. The Maya did not need to predict a single apocalypse to know this. They had built their civilization around the truth that order is temporary, sacred, and labor-intensive. The tragedy is that they were right. The world they predicted was not the end of the planet. It was not a sky splitting open on a single appointed morning, not a final darkness swallowing every city at once, not the theatrical apocalypse later imagined by people far removed from the forests, fields, and reservoirs where Maya history actually unfolded. The world they predicted was more intimate and more frightening. It was the end of order where order had seemed permanent. It was the failure of renewal in places built entirely around the promise that renewal could always be achieved. It was the realization that a king could stand on the correct day, before the correct monument, wearing the correct sacred regalia, and still be unable to make the rain return. That is what gives the Maya story its lasting power. They understood that time is not empty. It carries memory, danger, repetition, and obligation. They knew that endings are not rare intrusions into history, but part of the structure of existence. A day ends, a season ends, a rain ends, a cycle ends, a city can end, a world can end. Their calendars did not make them prophets in the shallow sense. They made them witnesses to a deeper pattern no human order survives by existing once. It must be renewed again and again through labor, belief, water, food, trust, and adaptation. For centuries, Maya kings claimed to perform that renewal. They raised monuments at period endings, built temples above older temples, tied their bloodlines to gods and ancestors, and transformed cities into sacred machines of memory. At their height, the great centers must have seemed almost impossible to imagine without people. Plazas rang with ceremony. Roads shone white through the landscape. Reservoirs gathered rain. Scribes counted days back into mythic time. Farmers brought maize from fields shaped by generations of knowledge. The whole world appeared interlocked sky, stone, ruler, crop, ancestor, and calendar. But interlocked systems can fail in interlocked ways. Drought weakened water and food, hunger strained households, war made roads dangerous, political rivalry shattered cooperation, ritual demands grew heavier, royal authority became less convincing. The very institutions that once held the world together struggled to respond when too many pressures arrived at once. The Maya had a language for endings, but language could not stop the dry season. The calendar could mark a threshold, but it could not guarantee that a city would cross it. And yet, the end was never total. That may be the final correction to the myth. The Maya did not disappear into their prophecy. They survived beyond the fall of many royal cities. They carried memory away from abandoned plazas. They continued to plant, speak, worship, adapt, resist, and remember. Their descendants still live, and their presence is the strongest answer to every old fantasy of vanishing. What ended was not a people, but a particular world of divine kings, monumental calendars, and stone cities that could no longer renew themselves. So the ancient prediction, if we can call it that, was not written as a sentence. It was built into the way the Maya understood time. Worlds before this one had failed. The present world required care. Every cycle ending asked whether order could continue. That question became historical. In the classic Maya collapse, it was answered not by one apocalypse, but by many human decisions made under heat, hunger, fear, memory, and hope. The carved stones remain because stone is patient. They still hold names, dates, victories, ceremonies, and claims of sacred power. But around them is the quieter truth. The forest returned. The kings fell silent. The people moved on. Time did not stop. It simply continued past the world that had tried to master it. And in the end, that may be the most haunting lesson the Maya left behind. Civilizations rarely believe they are temporary while they are building themselves. They measure, expand, decorate, record, and declare permanence. They turn their values into architecture and their fears into ritual. They imagine that because a system has worked for generations, it will keep working for generations more. But the Maya knew, somewhere deep in their calendars and myths, that every age stands on a threshold. The question is never whether time will turn. It always will. The question is whether the world waiting on the other side can still be held together. The ruins grow quieter as evening settles over them. The last light touches the upper stones first, then withdraws down the stairways, leaving the plazas in blue shadow. Birds call from the canopy. Insects begin their steady rhythm. Rainwater rests in broken hollows where feet once passed, where rulers once stood, where people once looked upward and believed the movements of the sky were tied to the fate of their city. There is no need to imagine the place as cursed. Its silence is not empty enough for that. It is full of labour, memory, skill, ambition, devotion, fear, and endurance. Every block was carried by hands. Every field was planted by someone watching clouds. Every date was carved by a mind trained to see human life inside vast cycles. Every abandoned room once belonged to a present tense as real as ours. The Maya world did not end because ancient people were foolish, or because prophecy doomed them, or because mystery swallowed them whole. It changed because even brilliant societies live within limits. Water has limits. Soil has limits. Trust has limits. Authority has limits. Ritual has limits. A civilization can stretch those limits with intelligence and beauty for a very long time, but it cannot pretend they are not there forever. Still, beyond the ruins, life continued. That is the softer truth at the edge of the darkness. People carried seeds. They carried words. They carried stories of creation and failure, of maize and ancestors, of days that return with different burdens. They carry the knowledge that an ending is not always the same as extinction. Sometimes it's a passage through loss into another form of survival. So the final image is not only a ruined temple under the forest, it is also a path leading away from it, worn first by those who left, then hidden by leaves, then found again by memory. Above it, the sky keeps moving with the same calm precision the ancient observers knew so well. The sun disappears, the stars come forward. Somewhere beyond the trees, another morning waits, not promised, not guaranteed, but possible.